picture this. You're standing in the middle of a sprawling, windswept wetland.
Okay, setting the scene.
Yeah, so the air is biting. It's carrying that sharp chill of a world locked in the deep freeze of an ice age.
Right.
And you're looking down at a patch of exposed, slightly dried mud right along the edge of what we now know as ancient Lake Otero in New Mexico.
Which is white sands today, right?
Exactly. And pressed deep into that mud is the distinct, unmistakable track of a massive, extinct Columbian mammoth.
Wow.
You can almost see the sheer weight of the animal that left it, but right over top of it, overlapping that prehistoric imprint in the mud, is something else entirely.
Something that shouldn't be there.
Right. A human footprint. A bare human foot with distinct toes and a heel pressed directly into the earth exactly where that mammoth had just walked.
It's an incredible image.
It really is. It puts a chill down your spine just visualizing it. But here's the bombshell that completely shatters everything we thought we knew about the timeline of our world.
The date.
The date. That human footprint is 23,000 years old.
Yeah. And it is a date that fundamentally breaks the established models of human history. I mean, we're talking about a time when the North American continent was isolated from the rest of the world.
Completely isolated.
Right, supposedly thousands and thousands of years before the first humans ever set foot here.
Exactly. Welcome to the deep dive into today's source material. We are looking at a really fascinating, incredibly rich stack of research today.
We really are.
We've got breaking news reports on those very footprints in New Mexico. We have detailed archaeological site reports from deep in the Alaskan tundra, ancient climate and geological data from the Canadian plains.
And that sweeping historical breakdown of early Mesoamerican agriculture.
Right. And our mission for this deep dive is to weave all of this together to trace the epic, honestly seemingly impossible journey of the first Americans.
To figure out how they actually got here.
Yeah, how they got here, how they survived wild, violent global climate swings by adapting the very stones they used, and how they eventually laid down roots to engineer the plants that built human civilization in this hemisphere. So, okay, let's unpack this.
I am really looking forward to this one. Think of me as your guide today.
Yeah.
We're going to connect the dots across tens of thousands of years of geological and human history.
I love that.
Yeah, we're going to take these highly specific, sometimes highly technical scientific discoveries and translate them into a broader narrative of absolute human resilience.
So to really understand the impact of that footprint in the mud, I feel like we first need to understand the accepted reality it just completely blew up.
Right.
Because for decades, the field of archaeology had a very strict, very confident answer to the question of when people first arrived here, right?
Yes, they did. For a very long time, the dominant, almost unshakable framework in the field was what we call the Clovis first paradigm.
Clovis first.
Exactly. When you look at the archaeological sources, the Clovis culture was considered the absolute baseline. It was the oldest archaeologically visible, well-defined human presence in North America.
Okay.
And what is so remarkable about the Clovis paradigm is how incredibly tight the established timeline was. We're not talking about a vague window of thousands of years.
Right.
The accepted time range for the Clovis culture was roughly 200 radiocarbon years.
Wait, just 200 years?
Just 200 years.
That seems impossibly narrow for an entire continent.
It is incredibly narrow. Specifically, the sources place the Clovis era between 11,050 to 10,800 radiocarbon years before present.
Okay, and just for clarity for everyone listening, in radiocarbon dating, before present mathematically refers to the year 1950.
Exactly, because that is when atmospheric nuclear testing started messing with global carbon levels. Yeah. So we're talking about a very specific window, roughly 13,000 calendar years ago.
And the reason archaeologists were so confident about this narrow window is because these people left a very specific calling card behind.
The Clovis point.
Right, the Clovis point.
Yeah.
I'm looking at the diagrams in the research, and this wasn't just a generic crude arrowhead. It was a highly distinct, symmetrical, fluted stone spear point.
The masterpiece, really.
Yeah, and the wildest part about the Clovis phenomenon isn't just the craftsmanship, it's the geographical spread. These points have been found in all 48 of the lower United States.
It is the most geographically extensive archaeological signal in North American history.
You find them from a farm in Pennsylvania to a desert in Arizona. So, you can see why scientists were so confident the evidence was literally everywhere.
Right, and it all pointed to this exact tidy window of time. It created a very neat narrative.
Which was what, exactly?
The story went like this. The massive continental ice sheets from the last glacial maximum finally start to melt. A massive ice-free corridor slowly opens up through Canada. People migrate down from Asia through that corridor. They bring this incredible specialized stone tool technology with them, and they rapidly populate the entire continent in a geological blink of an eye.
It made perfect sense.
It made perfect sense. The data aligned. Until, of course, we started finding things that simply did not fit that story.
Which brings us directly back to White Sands National Park in New Mexico. This is the absolute bombshell in our stack of sources.
It really is.
Researchers excavating an ancient alkali flat, essentially a dried-up lake bed, found extensive human footprints dating between 21,000 and 23,000 years ago.
Mind-blowing.
Now, just to put that in perspective for you listening, 23,000 years ago is right in the absolute middle of the last glacial maximum. The ice sheets to the north were at their peak.
It was an impassable wall of ice.
Exactly. It is essentially like excavating a medieval castle in Europe, digging under the foundation and finding an iPhone.
That's a great analogy.
It simply shouldn't be there according to every established rule of the timeline.
And what's fascinating here is the sheer level of intense scientific scrutiny that these footprints were subjected to.
Oh, I bet.
Because when you publish a paper that claims to completely overturn a century of established archaeological dogma, you cannot just bring an interesting theory.
Right.
You have to bring absolutely bulletproof, undeniable evidence. And initially, the wider scientific community brought intense skepticism, specifically regarding the dating methods.
Right, because I am reading the initial pushback in the academic papers here. Originally, the researchers dated these tiny little seeds from an aquatic plant called spiral ditch grass. I think the scientific name is Rupia serosa.
Yes, Rupia serosa.
All right, and these seeds were found embedded directly in the exact same mud layers as the footprints, but critics immediately raised a massive red flag about dating water plants.
They did.
And I have to admit, I got a little lost in the chemistry here. How can a plant give a fake date? Carbon is just carbon, isn't it?
That is a completely fair question. And it gets into a phenomenon known as the hard water reservoir effect.
Right.
It is a brilliant, highly technical piece of pushback from the critics. Here's how it works. Radiocarbon dating relies on measuring the radioactive isotope carbon-14, which is created in the atmosphere by cosmic rays.
Right.
Living things on land, like trees, grasses, and humans, absorb that atmospheric carbon. When they die, the absorption stops, the carbon-14 slowly decays at a known rate, and we use that decay like a stopwatch to see how long they have been dead.
Okay, that makes sense for things breathing the air.
Exactly. But aquatic plants, like that spiral ditch grass, don't just absorb carbon from the atmosphere, they live underwater. So they can absorb dissolved carbon directly from the water surrounding them.
Ah.
Now imagine that water is flowing over ancient limestone bedrock. Limestone is made of calcium carbonate that is millions of years old.
Right.
As the water flows over it, the bedrock slightly dissolves, releasing that ancient radioactively dead carbon into the water.
Oh, wow. So the plant is literally drinking carbon that is already millions of years old.
Exactly. The plant absorbs ancient carbon while it is still alive. So when archaeologists come along thousands of years later and run a radiocarbon date on that plant, the results come back artificially old.
That's insane.
The critics looked at the White Sands discovery and argued that the footprints aren't actually 23,000 years old. They said, you are just dating ditch grass that absorbed old groundwater from the bedrock.
They claimed the people could have walked there 10,000 years later.
Precisely.
That is such a fascinating, specific scientific objection. But the researchers at White Sands didn't just throw up their hands and give up.
Not at all.
The sources detail how they went back to the lab and performed what honestly looks like an absolute masterclass in scientific verification.
They had to. To bypass the aquatic plant issue, they needed terrestrial matter. They needed organic material that grew on land, breathed only atmospheric carbon, and could not be contaminated by the groundwater.
Right.
So they went back to the exact same geological layers of sediment containing the footprints and isolated terrestrial conifer pollen.
Creepo.
Specifically, microscopic pollen from fir, spruce, and pine trees that had blown into the mud 20,000 years ago.
But they didn't just find a few grains. I want to highlight the sheer scale of the effort here because it's wild. They use a technique called flow cytometry to physically separate the pollen from the dirt.
It is incredible.
I had to look this up because I had no idea what it was. It's a medical technology, right?
It is. Flow cytometry is normally used in immunology or cancer research to sort human cells.
Oh, wow.
You suspend cells in a fluid and pass them one by one through a laser beam.
Oh.
The way the light scatters tells a computer exactly what kind of cell it is, and it can physically sort them into different test tubes.
And they use this on dirt.
They adapted this medical technology to blast lasers at ancient mud suspended in fluid, specifically looking for the exact size and fluorescent signature of ancient pine pollen.
That is mind-blowing. They're using lasers to pick microscopic pine dust out of Ice Age mud.
Yeah.
And they isolated over 75,000 individual grains of pollen.
They needed that massive amount because a single grain of pollen doesn't contain enough carbon to date. By isolating 75,000 pure terrestrial pollen grains from the footprint layer, they gathered enough organic matter to run through an accelerator mass spectrometer.
And what does this say?
The radiocarbon dates on that atmospheric pine pollen came back exactly the same as the ditch grass seeds, 21 to 23,000 years old. The hard water effect was ruled out.
That is amazing, but they still didn't stop there.
No, they didn't.
They applied a completely different dating methodology that doesn't even use carbon. It's called optically stimulated luminescence, or OSL.
Yes.
And I need you to explain this to me, because measuring the last time a grain of sand saw the sun sounds like absolute magic. How does a rock know when it is in the dark?
It is one of the most elegant dating methods in geology. Think about a grain of quartz sand. At an atomic level, the quartz has a crystal lattice structure. Over time, while that sand is buried underground, it is constantly bombarded by very faint, natural background radiation from trace elements in the surrounding dirt, like uranium or potassium.
Like background noise.
Exactly. This radiation actually knocks tiny electrons out of their normal atomic orbits, and they get trapped in microscopic flaws or defects within the quartz crystal.
Okay, so the rock is essentially slowly absorbing and trapping energy from the dirt around it.
Precisely. It is acting like a tiny, extremely slow-charging battery. Now, if that sand is exposed to sunlight, the UV rays instantly bleach the crystal, flushing out all those trapped electrons and resetting the battery to zero.
Wow.
So if a human steps in the mud, churns up the sand, and then he gets buried by new sediment, it goes dark. The stopwatch starts again.
This is so cool.
Thousands of years later, scientists carefully extract that exact grain of sand in a completely dark room. They stimulate it with a specific laser. The quartz releases all those trapped electrons in a tiny microscopic flash of light.
And they measure the light.
By measuring the exact brightness of that flash and comparing it to the background radiation of the soil, they can calculate exactly how many thousands of years that sand has been buried in the dark.
That is just phenomenal. And the OSL tests on the quartz sand trapped completely inside the human footprints also came back, confirming the 23,000-year age.
The results were undeniable.
They brought 3 completely independent, scientifically rigorous, totally different lines of evidence to the table. They checked the water plants, they laser sorted the tree pollen, and they checked the atomic memory of the sand itself.
The debate was effectively over. It was a watershed moment. It forced the entire discipline to accept that humans were present in North America during the last glacial maximum.
So what does this actually mean for you, the listener? I want you to step back from the lasers and the radiocarbon charts and just visualize the human reality of this.
The human element is so important here.
Imagine standing in that freezing wetland. You are looking across the frost-covered grass and you are staring down a massive Columbian mammoth. And you are doing this a full 10,000 years before that textbook said the first humans supposedly arrived on the continent.
It rewrites everything.
These people weren't just a lost hunting party passing through, right? I mean, the sources detail footprints of teenagers messing around, of children splashing in the mud puddles, of a mother walking for miles carrying a toddler, shifting them from hip to hip as she got tired.
They were living rich, complex lives in a world we can barely comprehend today.
Right.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, it forces a massive geographical and logistical question.
Which is?
If communities of human beings were thriving in New Mexico 23,000 years ago, how on earth did they get there?
Right, the ice.
During this period, the last glacial maximum, Canada and the northern United States were buried under the Laurentide and Cordilleran continental ice sheets. These glaciers were, in some places, 2 miles thick. It was a continent-spanning, impassable wall of ice.
Right, which means they couldn't have just walked down from Alaska 23,000 years ago. The door was frozen shut.
Exactly.
Which means we have to look further back in time. We have to look north to the gateways of Canada and Alaska to figure out what the world looked like before that 2-mile-high wall of ice was built.
And our sources direct us to a specific geological period in the late Pleistocene geochronology of Western Canada. It is known as the Watino non-glacial interval.
Okay, pause. Late Pleistocene geochronology and non-glacial intervals. Can we translate this into plain English?
Absolutely. The Pleistocene is the scientific term for the Ice Age epoch, which featured multiple cycles of glaciers growing and shrinking. Geochronology is simply the timeline of the Earth.
Okay.
So in the timeline of the Ice Age, there was a specific period called the Middle Wisconsin Stage. During this stage, the climate warmed up enough that the massive glaciers covering Canada actually retreated,
Leaving it open.
This created the Watino non-glacial interval. Non-glacial meaning no glaciers. This wasn't a brief, freak, warm weekend. This was an immense interval lasting roughly 52,000 years, starting roughly 65,000 years ago.
52,000 years of open land.
Exactly. During this immense stretch of time, the landscape of southern Manitoba, Alberta, and the western Canadian plains was what geologists call subaerial.
Meaning open to the sky.
Meaning it was open to the sky, it wasn't crushed under a glacier, it was a living, breathing, photosynthesizing ecosystem.
And according to the fossil record in the sources, it was an incredibly vibrant ecosystem. This period aligns with what scientists call the Rancho-Labrian North American land mammal age.
Yes.
And the sheer scale of the animals living on the Canadian prairies during this time is staggering.
Yes.
We aren't just talking about a few deer, we are talking about an endless buffet of megafauna.
Oh, absolutely massive creatures.
Mammoths, mastodons, giant ground sloths the size of cars, dire wolves, saber-toothed cats, Native American camels, and ancient horses were all roaming this vast open corridor.
The environment was a highly productive mix of boreal forest, grassy steppes, and tundra. It was an environment that was absolutely mathematically capable of supporting a robust human hunter-gatherer population.
The carrying capacity of the land was immense. So the obvious burning question is, if the door was open and the food was there, were humans there?
And this is where the archaeological record gives us incredibly tantalizing, yet intensely controversial clues.
Okay, what kind of clues?
For example, the sources detail excavations in the Yukon, specifically the Old Crow area and the Bluefish Caves. Researchers have found mammoth bone cores and bone flakes dating to between 25,000 and 23,000 years ago.
And these are just random bones, right? They look like they were intentionally struck and fractured by human hands to make tools, or smashed open to extract the nutrient-rich marrow.
Right.
And closer to the plains, at the Grunthal Quarry in Manitoba, researchers found mammoth molars in ancient wood dating to 44,000 years ago, buried deep beneath the thick layers of rock and gravel left by the later ice sheets.
The Grunthal quarry finding is vital because it definitively proves the biological reality of that open environment. It proves the megafauna were there in Manitoba 44,000 years ago.
Right.
But when it comes to the broken bones at Old Crow or Bluefish Caves, we must acknowledge the extreme caution that defines the archaeological community.
Why are they so cautious?
Because finding a broken mammoth bone is not the same level of definitive proof as finding a beautifully carved fluted stone spear point. The entire debate centers on a field of study called taphonomy.
Taphonomy, that's the study of what happens to an organism after it dies, right? How it rots, how it gets buried, how it gets damaged.
Exactly. Taphonomy is the forensic science of decay and damage. Many experts look at the fractured mammoth bones from places like Old Crow and ask a very tough question. Are these fractures truly the result of human lithic reduction techniques?
Did a human actually hit it?
Did a human strike this bone with a rock at a specific angle to shape it? Or was this bone simply crushed by the massive jaws of a giant short-faced bear? Or perhaps it was snapped by the immense crushing pressure of river ice during a violent spring thaw?
Nature can mimic human activity in surprising ways.
Yes, it can.
Okay, here is where I have to push back a little on that intense scientific caution. Because look at the physical reality of the geology we are talking about.
Okay, let's hear it.
We know the land was completely habitable for 50,000 years. We know the megafauna they hunted were there in massive numbers. We know modern humans had already expanded across much of the globe by this point.
Right.
And we know that shortly after this warm period, the absolute most destructive force of nature on planet Earth, a continental ice sheet 2 miles thick and weighing billions of tons, bulldozed its way southward.
It did.
It ground the landscape down to the bedrock. It ripped up forests and pulverized mountains. So if a small population of nomadic hunter-gatherers lived in Manitoba 40,000 years ago and left behind a few scattered fire pits and some bone tools, wouldn't that massive glacier completely, utterly obliterate the evidence?
Yes.
Isn't an absolute absence of evidence exactly what we should expect to find under a crust, glaciated landscape? Why should we dismiss the possibility of humans being there just because a glacier ground the proof into dust?
That is the core of the friction in the field right now. What you are presenting is a highly compelling, entirely logical argument. It makes perfect logistical sense.
Thank you.
But archaeology, as a hard science, requires empirical, reproducible proof. A hypothesis about missing evidence destroyed by glaciers, no matter how logically sound or geographically probable, cannot replace a physical artifact found in a secure, datable, geological context.
So we can't write history based on what we assume was destroyed.
We cannot write history based on what we assume was destroyed. However, your point is exactly why findings like the Bluefish Caves are so critical, because in those caves, we see undeniable cut marks on bones that clearly mimic the V-shaped grooves left by stone tool usage, securely dated to 24,000 years ago.
Wow.
It forces the scientific community to keep an open mind. It suggests people were at least in the far north, waiting in the wings of Beringia long before the ice sheets melted.
If you have the perfect weapon, you can survive almost anywhere, but environments don't stay static. We know they were here in the Americas, either bypassing the ice down the coast or waiting it out in the north.
Right.
But how did they actually survive the violently shifting climates of the terminal Pleistocene? The end of the Ice Age wasn't just a gentle, gradual warming up.
Far from it.
It was a brutal, oscillating roller coaster of freezing cold and sudden warmth. To understand how humans survived that, our sources take us to the dirt of a single ancient hunting camp in central Alaska Owl Ridge.
Owl Ridge provides a phenomenal, highly localized lens to view a global human phenomenon. Geographically, the site is situated on a glacial outwash terrace in the northern foothills of the Alaska Range.
So it's high up.
It sits high up on a ridge, providing a clear, unobstructed vantage point over the Teklenika River Valley. If you are a hunter-gatherer looking to spot herds of migrating game from a distance, it is the perfect strategic lookout.
Makes sense.
And what makes the excavation at Owl Ridge so special is its stratigraphy, the distinct layers of dirt. It contains 3 chronologically separate cultural components. It essentially records 3 very different groups of people dealing with 3 massive, distinct climate shifts, all standing on the exact same ridge.
Let's look at that first group, because this is where the mechanics of human adaptation get real. Component 1 takes place during what scientists call the late Alarode period, roughly 13,300 to 13,000 calendar years ago. The climate at this exact moment was relatively warm for Alaska. The landscape around the ridge was a shrub tundra supporting a diverse range of animals. The people who camped at Owl Ridge during this time left behind tools belonging to what archaeologists classify as the Nenana complex.
Yes, the Nenana complex.
Their signature weapons were these small, teardrop-shaped or sometimes triangular stone points called chindaden points.
And when researchers physically analyzed the stone used to make these chindaden points, a very clear, very human behavioral pattern emerges. 60% of the tool stone found in this layer, specifically fine-grained cherts and cryptocrystalline silicates, was not local to the Owl Ridge area.
Meaning they brought it with them.
You cannot find that rock in the Teklenika River Valley. They had to carry it with them from distant geological sources.
I love this detail because it makes these ancient people so immediately relatable. They were operating as what anthropologists call landscape learners.
Landscape learners, exactly.
Think about it from your own perspective. Imagine you are heading out for a massive backcountry camping trip in an entirely new, massive wilderness you have never seen before.
You'd be pretty unprepared.
Exactly. You don't know where the freshwater streams are yet. You don't know where the dry firewood is. And if your survival depends on a sharp stone knife, you definitely don't know where to find good flint in the local hills.
So what do?
You pack all your own gear. You bring everything you need to survive from home in your backpack because you haven't yet learned the local landscape.
That is exactly the behavioral signature we are seeing. They were arriving in a new territory. They brought formal, finished tools and heavy cores of premium stone with them, used them to process their kills on the ridge, perhaps did some light resharpening which left tiny flakes behind, and then moved on.
But then the climate completely betrays them. We move up in the dirt to component 2, which aligns with a global climate event known as the Younger Dryas.
The Younger Dryas.
Wait, I have heard of the Younger Dryas. What exactly causes a sudden freeze like that? Is it just a string of really bad winters, or is it something bigger?
Oh, it is much bigger.
Yeah.
The leading theory is that as the massive ice sheets over North America were initially melting, an immense volume of fresh, freezing meltwater suddenly dumped into the North Atlantic Ocean.
Like a massive flood.
Exactly. This massive influx of fresh water essentially disrupted the ocean's thermohaline circulation, the deep ocean currents that transport warm water north from the equator.
Okay, so the ocean current stopped.
When that conveyor belt of warm water shut down, the northern hemisphere was plunged back into a sudden, brutal, deep freeze. This lasted roughly from 12,500 to 11,300 years ago. Temperatures plummeted. The region around Owl Ridge became incredibly arid and freezing.
So the plants changed.
The lush shrub tundra died back, replaced by sparse, dry, windswept vegetation.
And because the plants changed, the animal life completely flipped. The mesophilic animals, the ones that rely on a moderate, wetter climate, like moose, mostly vanished from the area.
They're gone.
The hunters standing on that ridge are suddenly left relying on hardy, cold-adapted grazers like bison and wapiti. And to hunt these different, tougher animals in a freezing, sparse landscape, their technology completely and abruptly shifts.
We see the arrival of a totally different tool set, classified as the Denali complex. The teardrop chin-deadened points are completely gone.
Just vanish.
In their place, we find robust lanceolate points and, crucially, a heavy reliance on microblade technology.
Can you explain microblades? Because when I hear blade, I picture a knife, but these are completely different.
They are very different. Microblades are tiny, razor-sharp slivers of stone, often no wider than a pencil and incredibly thin. You don't hold them in your hand.
Oh, okay.
Instead, hunters would take a piece of bone or antler, carve a deep groove down the side of it, and glue dozens of these tiny microblades into the groove using pine pitch or sinew. It created a devastating serrated composite spear point.
Which is an incredible technological leap, right? Because if you miss a mammoth and your spear hits a rock, a solid stone point will shatter and you have to nap a whole new weapon.
Right.
But with a composite microblade spear, if a few of the tiny blades break on impact, you just pop them out and glue in new slivers. It is modular technology.
Exactly. It is highly efficient. But the most revealing change during this freezing Younger Dryas period isn't just the shape of the tools, it is the material.
What happened to the material?
During this occupation, they arrived at Owl Ridge almost entirely empty-handed. They weren't carrying high-quality exotic chert in their backpacks anymore. They relied heavily on local, lower-quality stones found right there in the riverbeds and glacial outwash of the valley.
So they weren't tourists anymore. They had learned the landscape.
They definitely had.
They knew exactly where to find local, workable stone, even if it wasn't perfect, so they didn't need to waste precious calories carrying heavy cores of rock across freezing tundra. They adapted their entire supply chain to survive the cold.
This raises an important question about human resilience and behavioral flexibility. When faced with a sudden, catastrophic cooling of their environment that completely altered their food supply, they didn't just passively starve, and they didn't flee south.
They fundamentally altered their technological organization.
Exactly. They engineered new weapon systems to hunt different prey, and they applied an intimate knowledge of local geology to keep themselves supplied without wasting energy.
And that profound flexibility shows up again in the final layer, component 3. Eventually, the Younger Dryas ends. The ocean currents stabilize, and the climate warms up again, entering what is called the Holocene thermal maximum, around 11,300 years ago.
Right. Things are warming up permanently.
The glaciers retreat for good, and dense boreal forests start spreading across the Alaskan landscape. The view from Owl Ridge completely transforms from open, grassy tundra to thick, dense woods. And what happens to the tools left behind at the camp?
The hunting points almost entirely disappear from the archaeological record.
Because you cannot track and hunt large herds of grazing bison in a dense pine forest.
The subsistence strategy had to change again. Instead of weapon points, the artifact assemblage is dominated by processing tools. Scrapers, burins, all these tools meant for woodworking, scraping hides, and processing smaller, forest-dwelling game or plant materials.
And what were they made of?
They made these tools almost exclusively from local fine-grained igneous rocks, like andesite, found right there in the valley. The forest required a completely different approach to survival than the open tundra, and their toolkit reflects that adaptation instantly.
While the people of Owl Ridge were navigating these massive climate swings in Alaska by dropping their imported stones and utilizing local river rocks further south across the vast expanses of North America, a completely different, almost obsessive technological phenomenon was taking hold.
Yes.
While the Alaskans were going local, the people further south were completely obsessed with perfect premium stone. Which brings us back to the Clovis phenomenon and the search for the perfect tool.
We touched on Clovis earlier regarding the timeline, but we need to dive into what the technology actually represents. The Clovis point is not just a sharp rock. It is an absolute masterpiece of lithic engineering. It is a large, bifacially fluted point.
Let's break that down. What does bifacially fluted actually mean for the person making it?
Bifacial simply means it was worked on both sides to create a symmetrical lens shape. But the fluting is the genius part.
What's a flute in this context?
The napper carefully struck a channel, or a flute, up the center of the base on both sides of the point. This isn't just for aesthetics. This fluting created a thin groove that allowed the stone to be securely bound or hafted directly into a split wooden spear shaft.
Oh, I see.
It allowed the point to sit flush within the wood, which meant it could withstand the massive kinetic impact of striking a charging mammoth without snapping off at the base.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Remember how the later groups at Owl Ridge relied on local, everyday andesite river rocks to survive? The Clovis people were the exact opposite. They were absolutely obsessed with the extreme long-distance transport of the highest quality tool stone on the continent. The sources show instances of Clovis points made of premium chert or obsidian found hundreds of miles away from the geological source of that specific rock.
That's incredible.
They were moving across the continent carrying massive amounts of premium stone.
Which fuels an ongoing and very spirited academic debate among archaeologists.
Right.
What exactly is Clovis? We see this specific tool everywhere, but what does it mean?
Right.
Is it a distinct group of people, a specific culture, migrating across the continent, carrying their favorite rocks with them? Is it simply a time period? Or is it a techno-complex, a highly effective viral technology that spread rapidly amongst different groups of people who were already living there?
That's a huge distinction.
The archaeologist David Meltzer argues in our sources that we need to define Clovis strictly by its style, particularly the immense variation and deliberate design in the basal section, where that fluting occurs.
Why the base?
Because while the tip of a spear is constantly broken and resharpened during a hunt, the base hidden inside the wood is rarely altered. It holds the original intent, the style, and the cultural signature of the maker.
I am stuck on the logistics of this. Why do it? Why haul a heavy piece of premium chert 300 miles across a frozen, dangerous ice age landscape when you could just pick up a decent piece of andesite from a local riverbed and make a perfectly fine spear point? It seems like a massive waste of energy.
It comes down to the psychology of survival and the actual physicality of the stone. High-quality, fine-grained toolstone, specifically cryptocrystalline silicates like chert, flint, or obsidian, has a very specific microscopic structure.
Okay.
It behaves more like glass than like a porous rock.
Yeah.
When a master napper strikes a premium piece of silicate with an antler billet, they know exactly how the kinetic shock wave will travel through the stone. They know exactly what shape the resulting flake will be.
Because it fractures predictably.
Yes, in what is called a conchoidal fracture. Andesite or basalt, on the other hand, can have internal flaws, grain changes, or unpredictable densities.
And in an ice age environment, predictability is literal life and death. Put yourself in their shoes. Imagine you are tracking a dangerous herd of megafauna. You are 20 miles away from your camp, the wind is howling, it is freezing, and your main spear point breaks against a bone.
A terrible situation.
You reach into your leather pouch to quickly fashion a new one while the herd is moving. If you are using a local, low-quality rock, a hidden internal flaw might cause it to shatter completely uselessly in your hands after one bad strike.
Exactly.
You are left weaponless in the freezing cold, and you will likely starve or freeze. But if you are holding a piece of premium, transported toolstone that you carried from 300 miles away, you know for an absolute scientific fact that you can nap a lethal perfect point in minutes.
It's exactly. In a high-risk, high-stakes environment where one mistake means death, relying on unpredictable local stone is a massive gamble. Carrying the perfect stone wasn't an aesthetic luxury, it was a biological imperative.
It was risk management.
It is a profound risk management strategy. They spent the caloric energy to carry heavy stone to offset the massive environmental risks of their daily lives.
But ultimately, the Ice Age does end. The climate warms permanently. The massive glaciers melt, raising sea levels. The environment shifts from an unstable, high-risk deep freeze into the warmer, more stable Holocene epoch.
The world we know today, essentially.
Right, and the giant megafauna, the mammoths, the sloths, the saber-toothed cats go completely extinct. You can't hunt mammoths if there are no mammoths left. So what happens to these highly adapted hunters when the world changes forever? The ultimate human adaptation isn't just surviving a landscape with better stone tools.
No, it's not.
It is learning to actively control and engineer the landscape itself.
Which is a monumental leap in human cognition. To explore this, our sources take us away from the freezing outwashed terraces of Alaska and travel south, deep into the heart of Mesoamerica, during what is known as the Archaic period, stretching roughly from 8,000 to 2,000 BC.
At the beginning of this period, human populations in Mesoamerica were still organized as nomadic microbands. They were still relying entirely on hunting small game and gathering wild plants.
Very mobile.
But as the climate stabilized and became warmer and wetter, a monumental shift in behavior slowly began to occur. These nomadic bands began to notice patterns. They noticed that the seeds they gathered and ate, perhaps seeds they accidentally spilled near their seasonal camps, or seeds that passed through their digestive tracts undigested, would sprout into concentrated, reliable patches of edible plants the following year.
It was the realization of the agricultural mechanism. They realized they didn't have to endlessly chase the food across the landscape. They could coax the food to grow exactly where they wanted it.
Which changes everything.
Initially, they started cultivating what anthropologists call starvation foods. These were reliable, hardy, starchy plants that could buffer them against starvation when the hunting was bad or the seasonal drought hit.
And the social implications of this shift are almost impossible to overstate. When you rely solely on hunting and gathering, you must move constantly to find new resources. Because you are constantly moving, your population is strictly limited by what you can physically carry.
Right. You can't carry everything.
You can't have too many children at once. But agricultural reliability completely changes the biological math of human existence. It allows you to stay in one place. It allows for permanent settlements. It creates a massive, predictable surplus of caloric energy, which directly triggers a population boom.
And once you have a permanent village with a massive surplus of stored food, you no longer need every single adult in the tribe to spend every waking hour searching for calories just to survive the week.
That right there is the spark of civilization. You get the division of labor. Suddenly, because the farmers are producing enough food for everyone, someone else can spend their entire life becoming a master potter.
Or priest.
Someone else can become a priest, tracking the movements of the stars to predict the rainy season. Someone else can become a chieftain, organizing laborers to build a temple. Social stratification is born. And in Mesoamerica, this entire revolution, the rise of the massive empires we know today, was built primarily on the backs of three incredible plants, famously known as the Three Sisters.
Maize, squash, and beans. Cultivating these three crops together in the same plot of dirt is an act of sheer, profound ecological genius. They don't compete with each other. They form a symbiotic biological relationship.
How does that work?
Well, the maize grows tall and strong, providing a natural, sturdy stalk for the bean vines to climb.
Oh, nice.
The beans are nitrogen fixers. They have symbiotic bacteria in their roots that pull nitrogen directly from the atmosphere and convert it into a bioavailable form, naturally fertilizing the soil for the other two plants.
Oh, so they feed the soil.
Yes. And the broad, flat, spiky leaves of the squash plant spread low across the ground, acting as a living mulch that retains vital soil moisture and physically chokes out competing parasitic weeds.
Our sources give us some amazing specifics on the timeline of this botanical engineering. In the Guilanacuitz cave in Oaxaca, archaeologists found physical evidence of domesticated squash seeds dating all the way back to 8,000 BC.
That's incredibly old.
But the absolute crown jewel of Mesoamerican agriculture, the engine of their empires, is maize. And the story of maize is arguably one of the most miraculous genetic leaps in the history of biology. Because corn didn't just exist in the wild waiting to be eaten. It was intentionally engineered by ancient farmers from a wild scrubby grass called teosinte.
If you look at teosinte, it barely resembles modern corn. It has a tiny brittle spike containing just a handful of kernels, encased in a rock-hard shell that will literally crack your teeth if you try to chew it.
That does not sound appetizing.
It is not an obvious food source.
So how do you get from a tough, useless weed to a massive yellow ear of sweet corn? Did these ancient foragers even know they were doing genetic engineering?
They didn't know the molecular biology, but they intimately understood selective breeding. Generation after generation, a farmer would notice one single teosinte plant out of 1,000 that had a slightly softer shell, or maybe 2 extra kernels.
They paid attention.
They would save the seeds from that specific mutant plant and plant them the next year. They did this patiently, year after year, century after century. It was an agricultural science project that took thousands of years.
Wow.
The oldest known partially domesticated maize cobs, also found in that Gilaniquitz cave, date to 4300 BC, and they are still only a few inches long. It took millennia of intentional human selection to engineer the massive cobs that could fuel a civilization.
And their agricultural mastery extended far beyond just the food on their plates. The sheer diversity of the plants they domesticated is astounding. They cultivated specific species of rubber trees solely to harvest the latex sap, which they processed to create heavy, bouncing rubber balls.
For the bowl games.
Right. These balls were the central element of the deeply significant and often ritualistically fatal Mesoamerican ball games that defined their culture. They domesticated wild cotton, selectively breeding it over centuries to produce longer, stronger fibers that could be woven into vibrant, socially significant textiles.
And we can't forget cacao.
Oh, yes. They cultivated cacao trees in the shade of the jungle canopy, painstakingly processing the bitter, fermented seeds into chocolate. This chocolate was considered so incredibly valuable, it was used both as a sacred, frothy ritual drink for the elite and literally as physical currency in their sprawling trade networks.
But we must also recognize that farming in Mesoamerica was completely unlike farming in the fertile, predictable river valleys of Egypt or Mesopotamia. The Mesoamerican environment was actively, aggressively hostile to farming. They were not dealing with deep, rich topsoil. They were dealing with thin, highly acidic, nutrient-poor jungle soils, steep, rocky mountainous terrain, and dense, encroaching rainforests.
Wait, I always assumed jungle soil would be incredibly rich because there is so much green life growing there. Why is it terrible for farming?
It is a common misconception. In a rainforest, the vast majority of the nutrients are locked up in the living biomass, the trees, the vines, the canopy itself. The soil beneath is heavily leached by constant rain.
Oh, I see.
If you just clear a patch of jungle and plant seeds in the dirt, the crops will fail almost immediately because the soil is dead.
So how did they feed millions of people in a jungle?
Which is why they developed highly specialized, ingenious farming techniques. To combat the poor soil quality, they relied heavily on a practice called the milpas cycle, which utilizes slash and burn or extensive farming. By cutting down a specific patch of jungle and intentionally burning the vegetation, the resulting ash temporarily injected massive amounts of locked-up carbon and nutrients directly into the thin soil. They would farm that specific plot intensely for a few years until the nutrients were completely exhausted and then let it lie fallow.
So they let it rest.
They would move on to a new plot, allowing the jungle to naturally reclaim and regenerate the old one over a decade before returning to it.
They were managing the entire forest as a rotation of fields.
Exactly. They also utilized what are known as pet cot. These were highly managed, circular, stone-walled forest gardens integrated directly into the jungle environment, where they grew concentrated clusters of fruit trees and medicinal plants without clearing the canopy.
It was an absolute comprehensive mastery of their environment. They didn't just survive the jungle, they managed it.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the intentional generation-by-generation domestication of teosinte into maize stands as arguably one of the most essential, consequential advancements in the history of human life on this planet.
It's hard to understate it.
It was the biological engine that generated the immense, reliable caloric surplus required to build the towering stone pyramids, the sprawling, complex cities, and the vast, sophisticated empires of the Maya and the Aztecs. Without that specific genetic leap, engineered by patient early farmers sitting in the dirt, the trajectory of the entire hemisphere is vastly, unimaginably different.
Okay, let's bring all of this together. Think about the massive, incredible journey we just took through these sources. We started by looking down at 23,000-year-old human footprints pressed into the freezing mud of a New Mexico wetland, staring at the undeniable physical evidence of people who, according to a century of textbooks, supposedly shouldn't exist.
And we followed their trail.
We followed the hypothetical trails of those first Americans north, looking at the 50,000-year ice-free corridors of Canada, past massive herds of giant sloths and mammoths, questioning how glaciers might have pulverized their campsites into dust.
Right.
We sat with the survivors at the Owl Ridge camps in Alaska, watching them literally drop their precious imported exotic chert and pick up local river rocks just to survive a sudden, brutal plunge into the younger Dryas deep freeze.
Talk about adaptation.
And finally, we traveled into the dense, humid, acidic forests of Mesoamerica, where the descendants of those Ice Age nomads looked at a tough, useless weed called teosinte and slowly, patiently, generation by generation, engineered it into the biological lifeblood of an entire civilization.
It is a continuous, unbroken story of relentless human adaptation. From altering the physical shape of a stone spear point to survive a winter, to fundamentally altering the genetics of the global food supply to build an empire.
So I want you to think about your own life for a second, because the fundamental human mechanism of survival hasn't changed in 23,000 years.
That's true.
When the environment around you suddenly shifts, whether we are talking about literal climate change affecting your city, a massive unpredictable disruption in your workplace, or a fundamental disorienting shift in your culture, how do you react?
Good question.
Do you stubbornly cling to your old tools, your old ways of thinking, expecting the environment to magically change back to accommodate you? Or do you do what the survivors at Owl Ridge did? Do you drop the heavy baggage, look at what new resources are available right in front of you, and learn the new landscape?
That is the ultimate, enduring lesson of the archaeological record. Adaptability is the only true security we have. But I want to leave you with a final, slightly unsettling thought to mull over as we wrap up this deep dive.
Okay, let's hear it.
Think back to White Sands. If a handful of microscopic, fossilized ditch grass seeds and a few human footprints pressed into the New Mexico mud could instantly push human history in the Americas back by almost 10,000 years, completely shattering a century of established, rigorous, confident academic consensus in an instant.
It's crazy to think about.
What entirely different chapter of the human story is sitting undiscovered right now, just inches beneath a modern parking lot or at the bottom of a suburban lake?
That is exactly what keeps the science moving forward. There is always another footprint waiting to be found in the mud. Imagine you're sitting in a helicopter, right? And you're flying over just this endless, totally empty stretch of dense tropical rainforest.
Just an absolute ocean of green canopy.
Exactly. Just green for miles.
Yeah.
And someone hands you a pair of magical X-ray goggles that lets you just strip away every single leaf, every tree, every vine.
Which would be quite the pair of goggles.
Right. But you put them on, you look down, and instead of empty jungle, you are suddenly staring at this sprawling, hyper-connected infrastructure of basically a modern-day Los Angeles.
Yeah, like highways, massive water reservoirs, super dense neighborhoods.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, for well over a century, we thought the ancient Maya civilization was just, a few isolated, mysterious stone temples just lost in this empty jungle.
Right. We essentially treated these sites like Hollywood backlots.
Totally. We admired the beautiful stone facade, and we just kind of assumed there was absolutely nothing behind it.
It was a very comforting narrative, I think.
Yeah.
It made the ancient world feel small, manageable,
Right.
But it was completely breathtakingly wrong.
Well, welcome to the deep dive. If you're listening to this, you're probably someone who, like us, loves getting past those superficial historical myths.
The kind of textbook summaries that leave out all the really good stuff.
Exactly. Today, we are taking you right into the heart of the Maya civilization, and we are moving way, way beyond those outdated tropes of, mysterious disappearances and jungle priests.
Yeah, we are looking at a society that was so advanced, so densely populated, and so profoundly interconnected that it almost defies logic.
It really does. And the stack of sources we have to work through today is just phenomenal.
It's incredible. We're looking at a society that fundamentally redefines human achievement in the Americas.
Yeah, the stack is amazing. We're digging into a breaking August 2025 archaeological news report detailing some massive new LiDAR discoveries.
Which are just blowing everyone's minds right now.
Completely. And we've also got a really dense but fascinating academic chapter. It compares the wildly different urban planning of two neighboring Maya superpower cities, Tikal and Karakol.
Two very different ways to run a city.
Right. We're pulling from a comprehensive exploration of Maya astronomy and timekeeping, the overarching historical timeline, and oh, this is the one I have been dying to talk about.
The Montreal study.
Yes, the brand new 2026 study at the Université de Montréal that completely rewrites the story of the famous Maya collapse.
So our overarching mission today is to synthesize all of this for you. We really need to understand the true kind of dizzying scale of the Maya world.
Yeah, we're going to explore their brilliant engineering, how they managed to literally build their concept of time into stone.
And how this new 2026 data proves their downfall was actually a complex cascading failure of a network rather than just a simple story about a drought.
Okay, let's just jump right into that X-ray vision analogy, because I really want you to explain to me and to everyone listening how modern technology is proving that this jungle was hiding a society on a scale that shouldn't even be possible.
Yeah, let's get into it.
Take us into this 2025 LIDAR study.
Well, to really wrap your head around the Maya, you have to first understand the physical environment they lived in.
The jungle.
Right. For centuries, the jungle of the Piton region in Guatemala, which is kind of the heartland of the classic Maya, it simply would not let us see the true scale of what was there.
Because it's just so overgrown.
Incredibly overgrown. The canopy is dense, the undergrowth is thick. I mean, you can literally be standing 30 feet from a massive multi-story stone pyramid and have absolutely no idea it's there.
Wow. So for 100 years, traditional archaeology was essentially what? A guy with a machete hacking through a wall of vines, just hoping he tripped over a temple?
Basically, yeah. Which is agonizingly slow. It's exhausting, and it leaves you with an incredibly narrow, biased field of vision. You only find what you physically stumble into.
Which is where the LIDAR comes in.
Exactly. Enter LIDAR. That stands for light detection and ranging. It's those X-ray goggles you mentioned earlier.
How does it actually work in practice?
So researchers mount a specialized scanner on an airplane, and they fly it back and forth over the jungle, shooting billions of laser pulses down at the ground.
Billions. So it's not like a camera taking a picture, it's a literal physical measurement of distance.
Exactly. It's mapping the topography in incredibly high resolution. Now, most of those laser pulses, they hit the top of the tree canopy and bounce back to the plane.
Right. Because the leaves are in the way.
Yeah, but a tiny, tiny fraction of them make it through the microscopic gaps in the leaves, hit the actual forest floor, and bounce back.
Oh, wow.
And then a computer algorithm takes all that data, strips away all the laser hits that bounced off the trees, and leaves you with a flawless, three-dimensional topographical map of the bare ground.
That is just wild. You click a button and the jungle literally disappears.
It's like magic, honestly.
I remember reading about a major LIDAR study back in 2018 that kind of set the baseline for this whole thing.
Yeah, the 2018 study was a massive paradigm shift for archaeology. It mapped a section of the Piton and instantly revealed 60,000 uncharted structures.
60,000?
Just from that one scan. And based on that, archaeologists estimated the late classic Maya population, that's roughly between the years 600 and 900 CE, was somewhere between 7 and 11 million people.
Which at the time was mind-blowing.
Totally mind-blowing.
But the source we are looking at today is from August 2025. It's a new regional scale analysis led by Francisco Estrada Belli out of Tulane University. And they didn't just map a single area.
No, Estrada Belli's team did something absolutely unprecedented. They took multiple new LIDAR scans, combined them with reprocessed, older environmental LIDAR data from NASA, and mapped an astonishing 95,000 square kilometers.
Across Guatemala, southern Mexico, and western Belize, right?
Yes.
If you're trying to picture 95,000 square kilometers, that is roughly the size of the entire state of Indiana.
Indiana, mapped down to the meter.
It's just completely mapped. And the population numbers they extracted from this new 2025 data, they completely blew the 2018 baseline out of the water.
They really did. The population estimates for the late classic period jumped by 45%.
Wow.
The new data suggests the population wasn't 7 to 11 million. It might have reached as high as 16 million people.
16 million people. I mean, that is essentially the entire population of modern-day Guatemala, but living over 1,000 years ago.
Exactly.
And we really have to remember the context here. They are doing this without fossil fuels, without horses or oxen, without the wheel being used for transportation, and without metal tools.
Right. They built a literal megalopolis with stone tools and human sweat.
It's almost hard to process.
It is. But the sheer number of people isn't even the most revolutionary part of this 2025 study. It's actually where those people were. This data permanently destroys what we call the isolation myth.
This is a huge point in the source text. It says that nearly all of the rural settlements they discovered were within a 5-kilometer radius of a large or medium plaza group. What does that actually look like on the ground?
Well, think about your own town or city. You have a downtown area with government buildings, major markets, infrastructure.
Sure.
In the Maya world, that's a plaza group. It's a civic ceremonial center controlled by the elite.
Okay.
What the LiDAR showed is that there were no lonely, isolated farmers living off the grid in the deep jungle. Every single rural house, every hamlet, was closely tethered to one of these hubs.
Oh, I see.
The researchers stated unequivocally that no rural community could be regarded as isolated or independent.
So they were fully embedded in these massive networks. They had religious, economic, and political obligations to that central hub.
Absolutely.
It really is like an endless urban sprawl. You have the city core, you have the suburbs, you have the exurbs, and they are all tightly knit together by roads and economic reliance.
The entire landscape was just a managed, interwoven complex. But this level of density immediately triggers a massive logistical problem.
I'm so glad you brought this up because looking at these numbers, the math just doesn't work in my head.
Has
Well, if you pack 16 million people into a tropical rainforest environment, how do you keep them from starving? You cannot forage for 16 million people.
No, definitely not.
And if you just try to do basic slash and burn farming at that scale, you burn down the entire forest, you deplete the thin tropical soil in 2 years, and the whole society collapses.
And this is exactly where the LiDAR data gives us the answer. Because the lasers didn't just find houses and temples.
What else did they find?
They revealed an incredibly vast, heavily engineered agricultural infrastructure. We are talking about massive, landscape-altering terraforming.
Terraforming, not just clearing a patch of dirt.
Actual terraforming. The data shows endless networks of terracing carved into hillsides, massive irrigation canals, raised fields and wetland areas, heavily managed reservoirs.
That's incredible.
The Maya were not passively living in a jungle. They were aggressively engineering their environment to sustain an impossibly dense population.
Which points to a highly organized system, right?
Yes, a likely elite-controlled system of food production and distribution.
Which naturally begs the question, if you have 16 million people and you are literally reshaping the earth to feed them, how do you govern all of that? Because the Maya didn't have one single emperor ruling over everyone, right?
Right, they didn't. They were a network of independent city-states, actually very much like ancient Greece. And our sources reveal the Maya were definitely not a monolith.
Meaning you can't just generalize.
Exactly. You cannot look at one city and assume everyone else lived that way.
Which brings us perfectly to this brilliant academic chapter we have. It compares 2 neighboring powerhouse cities, Tikal in Guatemala and Caracol in Belize.
Yes, the tale of 2 cities.
These 2 cities were only 76 kilometers apart. That's what, like a 45-minute drive on a modern highway?
Pretty much. They were practically next-door neighbors in the ancient world, and their histories were deeply and often violently entangled.
How far back did they go?
Both sites were occupied very early on, starting around 800 to 600 BCE. They both traded with Teotihuacan, which is the massive metropolis way up in central Mexico. But the defining moment of their relationship happened in the year 562 CE.
Ah, the Star War. I love this term. Explain what a Star War is.
It sounds like sci-fi, but a Star War was a specific, highly ritualized type of decisive warfare for the Maya. They timed these massive conflicts to align with astronomical events.
Like specific planets.
Yes, specifically the cycles of the planet Venus. We'll get deeper into their astronomy later, but in 562 CE, Caracol, which had kind of been the underdog, operating under Tikal's shadow, they launched a Star War against Tikal.
And they won.
They won decisively. They completely conquered Tikal and even installed their own rulers in Tikal's central palaces.
Wow, so you have these 2 massive rival cities right next to each other, totally entangled in politics and warfare. But when you look at how they actually chose to build their cities and govern their citizens, they are complete opposites.
Complete opposite.
And reading the source, it really seems like geography played a massive role in forcing their hands.
Geography is always the stage upon which a society plays out. Let's look at Tikal's stage first.
Okay, paint a picture of Tikal.
So Tikal is built on relatively flat terrain, about 200 meters above sea level, but it is geographically boxed in by these massive natural features called bajos.
Bajos, these are basically giant seasonal swamps, right?
Yes, massive depressions in the earth. During the dry season, they are baked mud, but during the rainy season, They fill up and become impassable swamps.
Oh, wow.
So Tikal's flat, but it's physically constrained. They can't just build outward infinitely.
Right.
Now look at Caracol. Caracol is in the western foothills of the Maya Mountains. It's highly uneven, hilly terrain. It sits much higher in elevation, and it is built on karstic limestone.
Not meaning the rock is super porous, it's just full of cracks and caves.
Exactly. So if it rains at Caracol, the water doesn't pool on the surface. It immediately percolates down through the limestone into deep underground cave systems.
So neither city has a permanent river, neither city has a lake. They are 100% dependent on rain falling from the sky to survive.
Entirely rain dependent.
But Tikal is flat and surrounded by swamps, and Caracol is hilly, and the water just vanishes into the ground. How did they solve these completely different problems?
Well, Tikal took a highly centralized, top-down approach to survival. Because they couldn't easily sprawl out into the swamps, their city was densely clustered.
Makes sense.
To handle water, they built 6 massive, deep-dug reservoirs right in the central epicenter of the city.
Right next to the giant temples and palaces.
Exactly. They literally paved their massive plazas with plaster and angled them so that every drop of rain was funneled into these central, elite-controlled holding tanks.
That is brilliant.
It was a masterpiece of hydraulic engineering, honestly. But it meant that if you wanted water, you relied on the center.
And what about food, if they're boxed in by swamps?
Because they were boxed in, they practiced a more passive form of agriculture. They farmed the edges of the swamps when the water receded.
Was that enough for everyone?
Probably not. There's strong evidence suggesting that during the height of their population, Tikal couldn't grow enough food locally. They had to import bulk food via canoes, literally floating it across those flooded bayous during the rainy season.
So let me get this straight. If you live in Tikal, the elites control the water in the center, and the elites coordinate the fleets of canoes bringing in the food.
Yes.
That is a massive centralization of power.
It is absolute top-down control. Now, pivot to Caracol. Caracol is hilly, and the water disappears into the rock. You can't just funnel it into a central tank.
Right.
So Caracol goes the opposite direction. They aggressively terraform the entire landscape. Over the centuries, they built more than 160 square kilometers of agricultural terraces directly onto the limestone bedrock.
Just stop and think about that. 160 square kilometers of hand-built stone retaining walls, backfilled with soil, stepping up and down these massive hills.
It's mind-boggling.
That isn't just farming. That is fundamentally reshaping the earth.
Archaeologists call this land-esque capital. These terraces weren't just flat spaces to plant corn. They were highly engineered soil and water management systems.
How did they work with the porous rock?
They slowed down the flow of rainwater so it wouldn't wash the soil away, allowing it to soak into the crops before it hit the bedrock. And because their farming was spread out over these massive terraced hills, their water storage had to be decentralized too.
Because if you're working a terrace 3 miles from the city center, you can't walk all the way into town just to get a drink of water or fill a jug for your crops.
Precisely. So Caracol's citizens built their own water storage. Researchers have mapped over 1,500 formally constructed residential reservoirs spread across the entire settlement of Caracol.
1,500. So essentially every neighborhood, every cluster of houses has its own water tank and its own terraced farm. They're largely self-sustaining.
Yes, and this geographical difference, centralized versus decentralized, it manifests into a profound social difference. The architecture actually dictates the inequality.
And the academic source actually provides the Gini coefficients for both cities to prove this, which I thought was fascinating.
It really is.
I am not an economist, though, so break down what a Gini coefficient is for me.
Sure. A Gini coefficient is a statistical measure of wealth distribution or inequality within a society.
Okay.
A score of 0 means perfect, utopian equality. Everyone has the exact same amount of wealth. A score of 1 means absolute, dictatorial inequality. One single person owns absolutely everything and everyone else has nothing.
Okay, so where does Tikal land on that scale?
The Tikal has a Gini coefficient of 0.62.
Wow.
Yeah, that is incredibly high inequality.
So what does a 0.62 actually look like if I'm, just walking down the street in ancient Tikal?
If you're walking through Tikal, you feel the power of the elite just bearing down on you. Tikal has a single, massive, centralized market in the epicenter, built with permanent stone vaulted rooms.
So they control the trade, too.
Absolutely. Yeah. If you want foreign goods, jade, specialized tools, you have to go to the elite-controlled center to get them. And the religious architecture reinforces this hierarchy. Tikal is famous for its towering, incredibly steep temples, like Temple 1 on the Great Plaza.
The ones that rise up way above the jungle canopy, visible from miles away.
Right, they were essentially massive billboards of dynastic power. Tikal also built these things called twin pyramid groups.
What are those?
These were very specific, elite architectural complexes built to celebrate the end of a Khatun, which is a nearly 20-year cycle in the Maya calendar. The elites at Tikal linked the cosmic cycles of the universe directly to the glory of the king.
Wow.
Yeah, the royal tombs are ostentatious and located right in the center. The public rituals were basically state-sponsored propaganda to glorify the royal family.
So Tikal really operates like a rigid corporate monopoly. All the wealth, all the water, the market, the religion is all hoarded by a few people at the very top, and everyone else is just a subordinate.
But then you walk through Karakol. Karakol has a Gini's coefficient of 0.34.
0.34. That is vastly more egalitarian.
It's almost half the inequality of Tikal.
How does that physically show up in the city?
For one, Karakol is tied together by a massive network of causeways. These are wide, elevated stone roads. But unlike Tikal, where roads just lead to the central temples, Karakol's causeways radiate outward like the spokes of a wheel.
Connecting to the suburbs.
Yes, connecting the center to large open plazas spread throughout the sprawling suburbs.
So they decentralized the city itself.
Exactly. They had local administrative hubs and local markets. We find evidence of foreign trade goods evenly distributed across the entire population, not just in the royal palaces.
That's a huge difference.
It is. We also find widespread evidence of household crafting, regular people making stone tools, weaving textiles, working bone in almost every residential group.
But the part that really blew my mind was the religion aspect. If Tikal is celebrating time and the gods with these massive, exclusive twin pyramid groups, what are the regular people in Karakol doing?
This is perhaps the most stunning statistic from the comparison. At Karakol, approximately 70% of the residential groups included an Eastern shrine.
70%. So 7 out of 10 regular homes had their own dedicated religious shrine.
Yes. And these shrines weren't just like small altars. They contained family burials and formal ritual caches.
Wow.
The elites at Karakol still had power, certainly, but they intentionally lessened the visible divide. Even the biggest temple at Karakol, the massive complex known as Kamana, was built in a way that made its summit relatively private, not a public billboard like Tikal. At Karakol, the tracking of cyclical time and honoring the ancestors was integrated into the daily lives of the working class, literally in their own homes.
So if Tikal is a corporate monopoly, Karakol is just a massive, decentralized, self-sustaining co-op.
That's a great way to put it.
Now, I have a question about this. We said earlier that geography set the stage, right? Did the swamps of Tikal actively force them into a dictatorship, while the hills of Karakol forced them into a co-op? Or are we looking at two totally different human philosophies on how to run a civilization?
That is the core debate in the field. The terrain absolutely provided the constraints. I mean, you can't build massive central reservoirs on porous limestone.
Right.
But the paths they chose were active, deliberate human decisions. Building 160 square kilometers of stone terraces isn't just an accident of geography.
No, it takes planning.
It requires a staggering amount of coordinated initial labor, and it requires generation after generation to maintain it.
You just don't build that unless your society culturally values collective action.
Exactly. The leaders of Karakol made an intentional, society-wide choice to invest in long-term sustainability and the collective public good.
Well, Tikal went the other way.
Tikal, faced with its own constraints, actively chose a strategy of dynastic hoarding, centralized extraction, and rigid social stratification. They chose to be a monopoly.
It's wild. 2 cities, an hour apart, sharing the same gods, the same calendar, the same written language, but operating on fundamentally opposed political philosophies.
It really is fascinating.
And honestly, it makes me wonder how they viewed the universe. We know the regular people in Karakol were tracking time in those Eastern shrines. How did the broader Maya civilization actually conceptualize time and astronomy? Because they didn't just have a paper calendar hanging in the kitchen.
No, they didn't just measure time. They viewed time as a physical, cyclical force, and they literally built it into their stone architecture.
How advanced were they really?
Their astronomical knowledge was arguably the most sophisticated in the ancient world. It wasn't just science to them. It was the framework of their religion, their politics, and their daily survival.
Let's break down how their calendars actually worked, because it's not like our 12-month calendar. They had a few different systems that interlocked. I like to picture them as like different sized gears turning against each other.
That's the perfect analogy.
Yeah.
And we should note, they didn't invent this from scratch. They refined these systems from earlier Mesoamerican cultures, like the Olmecs.
Okay.
The two main cyclical gears were the Tzolk'in and the Hob.
Let's start with the Tzolk'in.
The Tzolk'in is the sacred religious calendar. It is exactly 260 days long. It works by combining 20 named days with 13 numbers.
Like 1, 2, 3.
Right, so you have 1 Amex, 2 IK, 3 Akbal, and so on, until the numbers and names cycle through all 260 possible combinations.
And 260 days isn't arbitrary. That is roughly the length of human gestation. 9 months.
Yes, exactly.
So the most sacred calendar is deeply biologically tied to human birth and the creation of life.
It's the rhythm of humanity. Now, the second gear is the Hob. This is the 365-day solar calendar. This is their scientific tracking of the Earth's orbit around the sun, very similar to what we use today.
Okay, that sounds familiar.
It consists of 18 months, and each month has exactly 20 days.
Wait, hold on, let me do the math. 18 times 20 is 360, but the solar year is 365 days. What happens to those last 5 days?
Those 5 days are called the Wayeb. And they were absolutely terrifying to the ancient Maya.
Terrifying. Why?
Because they sat outside the normal ordered structure of the months. The Maya believed that during the Wayeb, the barriers separating the earthly realm from the underworld dissolved.
Oh, wow.
It's a time of immense danger, bad luck, and cosmic instability. People would avoid leaving their homes, they wouldn't wash their hair, they wouldn't start any new projects. They were basically holding their breath until the new year locked the portals back up.
Okay, so you have the 260-day Tzolk'in gear turning and the 365-day Hob gear turning next to it.
And if you mesh those two gears together, a specific combination of a Tzolk'in day and a Hob day will only align once every 52 solar years.
That is the calendar round. 52 years, which, if you think about ancient life expectancies, is essentially one full human lifetime, a generation.
Exactly. To track time beyond a human lifetime, to record deep history and project into the distant future, they used the long count calendar.
Is that the linear one?
Yes. This was a linear count of days that started from a mythological creation date, which correlates to August 11, 3114 BCE in our calendar. This is the calendar that famously rolled over a major cycle in 2012, which pop culture totally misunderstood as an apocalypse prediction.
Right, the 2012 movie. But they weren't just doing math on paper. The source points out that the sky itself was a sacred, interactive map.
Absolutely. The night sky was the realm of the gods, and everything up there was deeply significant. But above all else, they were obsessed with Venus.
Venus. Not a goddess of love for the Maya, I'm guessing?
Quite the opposite. For the Maya, Venus was associated with the god Kukulkan, the feathered serpent, and it was deeply tied to warfare and destruction.
Whoa.
The Maya astronomers tracked the 584-day synodic cycle of Venus with terrifying pinpoint precision. We know this from the Dresden Codex.
The Dresden Codex is one of the only Maya bark paper books that survived the Spanish burning them, right?
Yes. It contains incredibly complex Venus tables. The astronomers used these to predict exactly when Venus would disappear and reappear as the morning star or the evening star. And they used these predictions to literally schedule their wars.
The Star Wars we mentioned earlier between Caracol and Tikal, they weren't fighting over a border dispute on a random Tuesday. They were waiting for Venus to hit a specific phase so the cosmos would bless their attack.
Exactly. The sky dictated their foreign policy, but it also dictated their physical geography. They conceptualized the world through sacred cardinal directions, and each direction was assigned a specific color and a deep philosophical meaning.
Walk me through these, because this explains a lot about how they built their cities.
East, known as Lycan, was associated with the color red. This is the direction of the rising sun, so it symbolizes the dawn, blood, birth, and the maize god rising from the underworld. It was the most auspicious, life-giving direction.
Wait, okay, that clicks. Earlier we said 70% of the homes in Caracol had an eastern shrine. They weren't just facing a random direction, they were deliberately aligning their household rituals with the energy of birth and the rising sun.
Precisely. They were anchoring their homes to the cosmic cycle. Moving on, north, Zemun was white, linked to the heavens, the ancestors, and wisdom.
Okay.
West, chichen was black. This is where the sun sets, so it was tied to the dying sun, to death, and the entrance to the underworld, Xibalba. South, Nohol, was yellow, representing the fierce midday sun and agricultural fertility.
And what about the center?
The center was green, or blue-green. It represented the Waka-chan, the great world tree, whose roots dug deep into the underworld, whose trunk stood on the earth, and whose branches held up the heavens.
That's a beautiful image.
It is.
Yeah.
Every Maya king essentially viewed himself as the living embodiment of that central tree.
And they took all of this, the calendars, the Venus cycles, the sacred directions, and they physically manifested it in their architecture. Which brings us to the purpose-built observatories and arguably the most famous Maya city on the planet.
Chichen Itza.
Chichen Itza is the ultimate masterpiece of Maya astronomical engineering. Let's look at the central pyramid, El Castillo, which is also known as the Temple of Kukulkan. It's not just a beautiful building, it is a literal functional calendar made of stone.
This blows my mind every time I hear it. Explain the math of El Castillo.
The pyramid has 4 staircases facing the cardinal directions. Each staircase has exactly 91 steps. If you multiply 91 by 4, you get 364.
Okay.
Add the single top platform that connects them all, and you get exactly 365, the exact number of days in the Hob solar year.
It's literally a 365-day clock you can walk on, but the shadow effect is what makes it legendary.
Oh, yeah. Twice a year, during the spring and autumn equinoxes, the geometry of the pyramid aligns perfectly with the setting sun. As the sun drops, the corner of the pyramid casts a shadow against the northwestern balustrade.
And what does it look like? This shadow creates a series of interlocking illuminated triangles that perfectly connect with a massive carved stone soaped head at the base of the stairs.
So for a few hours, twice a year, it looks like a massive glowing snake is physically slithering down the steps of the pyramid from the heavens to the earth.
It's an illusion of light and shadow, but it is purely deliberate. The architectural precision required to make that happen is staggering.
Why go through all that trouble?
It was designed to legitimize the power of the priests and the rulers. To a commoner standing in the plaza, the ruler was literally commanding the feathered serpent god to descend.
And El Castillo isn't the only astronomical marvel there. There's El Caracol.
Yes, El Caracol, meaning the snail. It's a very unusual circular building with a spiral staircase inside. It functioned as an observatory. It has these narrow asymmetrical windows near the top that perfectly align to track the extreme northern and southern positions of Venus on the horizon.
So they are constantly watching Venus.
Constantly.
Huh?
As well as the path of the sun during the solstices.
And we can't talk about Chichen Itza without talking about the Great Ball Court. It's the largest ball court in the Americas, stretching over 160 meters long. But the source focuses on the acoustics.
The acoustic engineering is flawless and frankly a little eerie. If you stand at one end of this massive 160-meter court and whisper, someone at the exact opposite end can hear you perfectly.
Just a whisper.
Just a whisper. And if you clap your hands near the tall stone walls, the sound bounces off in this rapid echoing chatter that sounds remarkably like the call of the quetzal bird, which is a sacred animal to the Maya.
And they weren't just playing soccer out there. The Mesoamerican ballgame was a deadly serious religious ritual.
It was a mythological reenactment of the Popol Vuh, the Maya creation myth, where the Hiri twins play a ballgame against the lords of the underworld. Sometimes, particularly during times of crisis, these games ended in human sacrifice to ensure the sun would keep rising.
So they were obsessed with time and cycles. We even see this in much older cities. The source mentions something called E-groups.
E-groups are fascinating. They are some of the earliest monumental architecture we find in the Maya world, heavily present in cities like Waxacton and Caracol. An E-group is a specific layout.
What does it look like?
You have a single pyramid on the west side of a plaza and a long raised platform with 3 smaller temples spread across the east side.
Okay, so if I am a priest standing on top of the western pyramid, I am looking east across the plaza toward these 3 smaller temples.
Exactly. And because the Maya understood the movement of the earth, they aligned this perfectly. On the exact day of the spring and autumn equinoxes, the sun rises directly behind the center temple.
Oh, wow.
On the longest day of the year, the summer solstice, the sun rises over the northernmost temple. And on the shortest day, the winter solstice, it rises over the southernmost temple.
It's a static, massive stone clock. You don't need a calendar. You just look at which temple the sun is behind. Okay, so I am picturing all of this. These cities are giant, interactive calculators. Every shadow, every staircase, every war is perfectly timed to the unbreakable, predictable cycles of the stars. But I have to challenge this philosophy.
Go ahead.
If your entire civilization, from when you plant corn to the divine authority of your king, is built on the absolute premise that the universe is perfectly predictable and cyclical, What happens when the Earth throws you a curveball?
That's the danger, isn't it?
Yeah. If the stars say everything is fine, but you suddenly get hit by an unpredictable earthly disaster, doesn't that make the society incredibly brittle? Did their strict adherence to cosmic cycles make them too rigid to adapt to reality?
That is the multi-million-dollar question, and the archaeological record suggests that the answer is a tragic, definitive yes.
Oh, real?
Yes. Classic Maya society was entirely predicated on the ritual authority of the ruler. The king wasn't just a politician. He was the primary mediator between the gods, the cosmos, and the common people. It was his job to ensure the rains came and the crops grew.
So if a massive drought hits, it's not viewed as a meteorological event. It is a theological crisis. It means the king is failing his cosmic duties.
Exactly. When systemic, long-term environmental changes occurred, the king couldn't just call an emergency council and say, well, the climate is changing. Let's invent a radically new economic policy.
Right.
The culturally bound response of the elite was to double down on what they knew worked in the past.
Because if the gods are angry, you just have to pray harder. You build a bigger temple, you launch more Star Wars to capture more prisoners to sacrifice to appease the gods.
Which is, of course, the worst possible response.
Yeah.
You are taking thousands of farmers out of the fields to build monuments. You are expending precious resources on warfare.
It's a vicious cycle.
Their rigidity in the face of unpredictable change exhausted the system. It became a fatal flaw.
And that rigidity perfectly sets the stage for our next segment, because it brings us right to the edge of one of the greatest mysteries in human history, the classic Maya collapse. Sometime during the 8th and 9th centuries, this megalopolis of 16 million people, filled with master astronomers and engineers, just completely unraveled.
This is the terminal classic period. And for decades, the academic world has leaned on a fairly standard, linear explanation for why this collapse happened.
If you open up a high school textbook right now, it will tell you the traditional theory. A massive, severe 200-year drought hit the Yucatan and Central America.
Right.
Combine that lack of rain with a booming population, massive deforestation because they were burning millions of trees to make white plaster for their temples, and exhausted soil, and the Maya basically starved to death in a man-made desert.
It's a very neat cautionary tale. The climate failed, the environment was ruined, so the society died. But the newest cutting-edge science tells us that this traditional explanation is missing a massive piece of the puzzle.
Which brings us to the centerpiece of today's deep dive. I have been so excited to talk about this. This is the brand new 2026 study by Benjamin Gwyneth from the Université de Montréal.
Yes, Gwyneth's team decided to look at an archaeological site called Laguna Itzan. This is located in the southwestern Maya lowlands near the mountains in Guatemala.
And the methodology they use here is just brilliant. They didn't go out looking for broken pottery or stone carvings. They went to the lake next to the ruins, Laguna Itzan, and they drilled deep down into the bottom to pull up massive tubes of mud.
They analyzed 4,000 years of lakebed sediment cores.
Sediment cores are incredible tools. They are essentially a vertical timeline of the environment.
Exactly. Every year, pollen, dust, ash, and organic material wash into the lake and settle at the bottom. Over millennia, it builds up layer by layer.
And what did they find in the mud?
Gwyneth's team analyzed these mud cores using 3 very specific geochemical markers.
Let's walk through these because this is absolute CSI level science. First, they looked at polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons.
Polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, or PAHs. That is the scientific term for the microscopic residue of smoke and ash.
Okay.
By measuring the concentration of PAHs in a specific layer of mud, scientists can tell exactly how intensely the Maya were burning the surrounding forest for slash-and-burn agriculture.
That is so smart. Marker number 2, leaf waxes.
Plants are very smart.
Yeah.
Based on the humidity and the amount of rainfall in a given year, plants alter the chemical composition of the waxy coating on their leaves.
Huh, I didn't know that.
Yeah, and when those leaves die and wash into the lake, those waxes are preserved in the mud. By analyzing the hydrogen isotopes in those ancient leaf waxes, we can reconstruct a highly accurate year-by-year record of local rainfall. We can literally measure ancient rain.
That's amazing. And the third marker, and this is the one that just makes me laugh at how clever science is, they measured fecal stanols.
Yes, fecal stanols. These are distinct organic molecules that are produced in the digestive tracts of humans and animals, and they are excreted in feces. And crucially, they are incredibly durable. They do not degrade easily.
You are telling me they measure 4,000-year-old human poop in the mud?
That is exactly what they do. Because humans lived around this lake, their waste inevitably washed into the watershed. By measuring the concentration of these human-specific stanols in a specific layer of the core, scientists have a direct, highly accurate proxy for the human population size.
So more stanols equals more people living around the lake.
Exactly.
So in a single tube of mud, you have a timeline of fire, a timeline of rain, and a timeline of population size. What did this mud actually reveal about the collapse?
First, it shattered some assumptions about their farming. During the earlier pre-classic period, the PAH data showed heavy use of fire. They were doing traditional slash-and-burn farming.
Okay.
But as we move into the classic period, the fecal stanols show the population absolutely exploding. And right as the population peaks, the fire markers plummet.
They stopped burning the forest.
Because the population was so dense, there was no forest left to burn. The data proves that to feed this booming population, the people of Itzan adapted. They shifted away from slash and burn and moved to highly intensive, fire-free agriculture, likely raised fields or terraces, just like we saw with the LiDAR data.
Wow, they successfully adapted their technology.
Yes.
Okay, so they solved the farming problem, but what about the massive 200-year drought that supposedly killed everyone?
This is the massive anomaly that Gwyneth's team found. When they looked at the leaf wax data to reconstruct the rainfall for Laguna Itzan during the Terminal Classic period, they found a stable climate.
Wait, what?
Laguna Itzan is located near the Cordillera Mountains. Because of the topography, it receives orographic rainfall rain generated by the air currents hitting the mountains.
So it stayed wet.
The data showed that while the central and northern lowland cities like Tikal were suffering through devastating civilization-ending droughts, Itzan had plenty of water. There was absolutely no local drought at Itzan.
Let me make sure I'm tracking this. The sediment core proves Itzan has a booming population. It proves they successfully adapted to intensive fire-free farming. And it proves they have a completely stable climate with plenty of rain.
That's what the data says.
By all traditional logic, Laguna Itzan should have been a thriving oasis while the rest of the Maya world burned.
That's exactly what logic would tell you. But the fecal stanol data reveals a completely different reality. During the Terminal Classic period, right when the drought is destroying the cities to the north, the stanol levels at Itzan drop off a cliff.
So what happened?
The population abruptly and completely vanished.
They collapsed at the exact same time as the drought-stricken cities, even though they had plenty of water. How's that possible?
I want to hear your thoughts on this. How do you interpret a city failing when its local environment is perfectly fine?
I keep coming back to a modern analogy. Think about the 2008 global financial crisis or the massive supply chain shocks we experienced recently. If a major shipping port shuts down in Asia, a factory town in the American Midwest might run out of microchips.
Right.
That factory has to close down, people lose their jobs, and the local town economy collapses. The local conditions in the Midwest were fine. It wasn't a tornado that destroyed the factory. It was the failure of the global network. Is that what we're seeing here with the Maya?
You have absolutely nailed it. That is the exact conclusion of the Gwyneth study. The classic Maya collapse was not a uniform, localized climate disaster. It was a cascading network failure.
A domino effect.
Precisely. Remember everything we discussed in the first half of this deep dive. The LiDAR data proved the Maya were not isolated. They were a hyper-interconnected civilization of 16 million people.
Right, the 5-kilometer radius thing.
Their cities formed a massive, complex web of economic dependence, political alliances, and trade routes.
They were trading bulk food, but also massive amounts of prestige items. Cacao, which they used as currency. Salt, which is essential for preserving food. Obsidian for weapons. Jade, quetzal feathers.
These trade routes were the arteries of the civilization.
So when the central lowlands, massive hubs like Tikal, were hit by severe prolonged drought, the strain on the entire network was immense.
And remember that rigidity we talked about?
Yeah, the kings couldn't adapt.
Exactly. The kings couldn't adapt. The crops failed. Wars broke out over the remaining dwindling resources. Massive waves of refugees began migrating away from the starvation zones.
And when those central nodes in the network fail, the arteries are severed, the trade routes shut down, the political alliances shatter.
Exactly. If Itzan relies on the central lowlands for obsidian tools, or for salt, or for political stability, it doesn't matter if Itzan has rain. The cascading crisis ripples outward.
The refugees flood in, the trade stops.
The regional economy disintegrates. The collapse dragged down healthy, perfectly stable cities like Itzan. Itzan didn't fall because it lacked water. It was pulled into the abyss by the unraveling of the broader regional system.
That is an incredibly sobering thought. It means that building a perfect local paradise, solving your local agriculture and water issues, it doesn't save you if the highways that connect you to the rest of the world collapse.
It completely reframes the narrative of the Maya collapse. It's no longer just an environmental cautionary tale about cutting down too many trees. It is a profound structural lesson in the inherent vulnerabilities of highly interconnected, complex societies.
I think we need to make a massive clarification here before we wrap up, because we keep throwing the word collapse around, and I don't want anyone listening to think the Maya just vanished into thin air like some sci-fi movie.
Right. It is crucial to understand that the Maya did not disappear. The collapse of the southern lowlands was catastrophic, yes, but it wasn't an extinction event. It was a brutal, massive restructuring of the civilization.
The network survived by shifting its nodes.
Exactly.
Where did millions of people go when the southern cities failed?
Activity and populations shifted drastically. Many moved north into the Yucatan Peninsula, and others moved south into the highlands of Guatemala.
And Chichen Itza, right?
Yes, Chichen Itza, which we discussed earlier, didn't collapse during this period. It actually rose to its absolute peak of cosmopolitan power and influence during the 8th and 9th centuries, exactly as the older southern cities were being swallowed by the jungle.
So as the South burns and starves, the North flourishes. But the society that emerged in this post-classic period was clearly different. Reading the timeline in our sources, it paints a picture of a very hostile, paranoid new reality.
The trauma of the collapse changed them. The post-classic era was defined by endemic, constant warfare. You see a massive shift in urban planning.
They stopped building the sprawling open cities.
The days of sprawling, unfortified garden cities out in the open plains were over. Post-classic cities adapted defensively. They intentionally relocated to easily defended, sheer hilltop locations.
They surrounded themselves with deep ravines, dug massive defensive ditches, and built high stone walls.
Places like Tulum on the coast, or the walled city of Mayapan. The golden age of open expansion gave way to an era of fortified strongholds and shifting military alliances.
And this fractured, fortified landscape is exactly what the Spanish encountered when they arrived in the early 16th century.
Which brings us to another fascinating, often misunderstood element of Maya history, the conquest. The Spanish contact period officially begins around 1511 when a Spanish caravel wrecked on the coast of the Yucatan.
Okay.
But the Spanish conquest of the Maya was completely unlike the fall of the Aztec or the Inca empires.
Right. Hernán Cortés marches into Tenochtitlan, captures the Aztec Emperor Moctezuma, and the Aztec Empire effectively falls in 1521. Francisco Pizarro captures the Inca Emperor Atahualpa in 1532. It's rapid decapitation. But the Maya?
The Maya didn't have a single emperor. They didn't have a centralized capital for the Spanish to capture. Because they were a vast, decentralized network of independent, heavily fortified city-states, the Spanish had to fight for every single inch of ground.
They had to conquer them piece by grueling piece.
Yeah.
The sources outline this brutal slog. In the 1520s, Pedro de Alvarado marches into the Guatemalan highlands. He systematically takes the Quiche capital of Cumarcaj, then the Cachical capital of Ixemche, then the Mam capital of Zacualú. Up north, the Yucatan Peninsula isn't fully subdued by the Montero family until 1546.
But the truly incredible part of this story happens back in the Piton Basin, the very heart of the old classic collapse.
Back in the swamps.
The dense, forbidding jungles and swamps that we talked about earlier, they became a massive, impenetrable natural fortress for the Maya who fled there.
And the last independent Maya city held out there for an impossibly long time.
Yes, the city of Tenochtitlan, the capital of the Itza Maya, located on an island in the middle of Lake Piton Itza. Tenochtitlan didn't finally fall to the Spanish until the year 1697.
1697, just stop and process that timeline. That is nearly 2 full centuries after that first Spanish shipwreck in 1511.
It's astounding.
To put that in perspective for an American audience, the Maya were still fighting off the Spanish in an independent island city almost a century after the British founded Jamestown in North America.
Their resistance was legendary. And crucially, that resistance wasn't just military, it was deeply cultural. The Spanish conquest stripped away the grand stone temples, they burned the books, they dismantled the elite ruling class, but they absolutely did not erase the Maya people.
And this is the most important fact we can possibly emphasize today. The Maya are still here. There are over 8 million Maya descendants alive right now, primarily living in southern Mexico, Guatemala, Belize, and Honduras.
Their culture proved incredibly, stubbornly resilient. Despite centuries of colonization, they maintained their traditional day-to-day life.
They kept their farming, their languages.
They kept their basic agricultural practices, their textile weaving, and crucially, their languages. Millions of people are still speaking Mayan languages today.
And amazingly, despite the Spanish doing everything in their power to eradicate the indigenous religion, the calendars survived.
They did.
The 260-day Tzolk'in calendar, that sacred cycle of human gestation, is still actively used today by traditional daykeepers in the highlands of Guatemala and Chiapas.
The cyclical time that they physically carved into the bedrock of Caracol and the staircases of Chichen Itza 1,000 years ago is still turning today. The gear never stopped.
It is an absolute triumph of human survival. All right, let's pull all these threads together. This has been a massive journey.
It really has.
We started by putting on our X-ray goggles, using LIDAR to peel back the dense jungle canopy to reveal a staggering 16 million people living in a hyper-connected, deeply engineered megalopolis.
We examined how two neighboring superpower cities, Tikal and Caracol, face their geographical constraints by choosing radically different philosophies of survival. Tikal choosing a rigid, centralized monopoly, and Caracol building a massive, decentralized terraced co-op.
We looked up at the night sky to see how they embedded the cycles of Venus and the sun into their very architecture, turning pyramids into grand, interactive cosmic clocks.
And we dug deep into the mud of Laguna Itzan to learn that their eventual collapse wasn't a simple localized drought, but a devastating, cascading failure across a complex, fragile trade network.
Which brings us right back to where we started. The ancient Maya were not a Hollywood backlot. They were not an empty facade. They were one of the most complex, populous, and sophisticated civilizations in human history.
And their incredible story leaves us with a profound final thought to ponder.
Okay, what is it?
We saw today that the Maya's greatest strength, their incredibly complex, hyper-interconnected network of trade and dense urban alliances, ultimately became the very mechanism that transmitted their collapse, dragging down even the healthy, stable cities.
A cascading failure of the network.
Exactly. So look around at our own modern, hyper-globalized world today. Our supply chains span the globe, our economies are deeply intertwined. A disruption on one continent immediately causes shortages on another. Are our modern societies building resilient, self-sustaining caracols with decentralized local resources that can weather a global storm? Or have we blindly built a world of centralized, fragile tikals, where a single disruption in the network could trigger a collapse? We are far too rigid to survive.
That is a question that is going to keep me up at night. Thank you all for joining us on this deep dive. Keep asking questions, keep exploring, and always remember to look beyond the facade to see what's really hiding beneath the canopy of history.
Imagine for a second undergoing a surgical amputation of your lower leg. But you aren't in a modern, sterile hospital.
Right. There's no modern anesthesia or, antibiotics.
Exactly. And after you miraculously survive this procedure and your bones knit back together, you eventually go right back to work.
Building the Great Pyramid of Giza, of all things.
It completely shatters that whole Hollywood image, doesn't it? The guy with the whip, the endless lines of disposable, starving slaves just dragging stones until they drop.
Yeah, that image is everywhere, but it's just not accurate.
Welcome to today's deep dive. We are so glad you're here with us because the stack of sources on the table today is going to dismantle almost everything you thought you knew about how the ancient world actually operated.
It is a seriously massive reading list today. I mean, we are covering a lot of ground.
Oh, definitely. Just to give you an idea of what we're working with, we have an excerpt from a textbook called Introduction to Maya Hieroglyphs, which gets deeply into the mechanics of how ancient societies recorded time and justified their power.
We've also got a comprehensive breakdown of Maya architecture.
Right. And then we have this highly insightful 2026 travel guide that compares the modern visitor experiences of Tikal and Chichen Itza.
Which is fascinating on its own. And anchoring all of this, we have a really dense scholarly edition of the International Journal of History and Archaeological Research Studies.
Which we're just going to call the journal from here on out to save breath.
Good call. And that journal covers everything from the bioarchaeology of the Giza pyramid builders to the maritime Silk Road, all the way over to religious syncretism in the Himalayas.
So the thread connecting all these seemingly disconnected academic papers and travel guides is this theme of monumental ambition.
That's exactly it. It's about scale.
Right, and that is our mission today. We are going to decode how human beings across time, from the blistering sands of Egypt to the dense jungles of Mesoamerica and the oceans of Asia, built literal and cultural empires.
How do they manage these mind-boggling labor forces without, modern technology?
How did they trade across entire oceans? And ultimately, when they faced catastrophic environmental and political pressures, how did they survive? Or, in some cases, why didn't they?
And the reason you should care about this isn't just to memorize some historical trivia.
Exactly.
The story of how ancient people mobilized labor, adapted to severe climate change, and merged conflicting worldviews, it's the exact same story playing out in our globalized, climate-stressed world right now.
The context changes, but the human mechanics of ambition, organization, and survival just remain startlingly consistent.
They really do.
So let's jump right into the flesh and blood of that ambition. Before we wade into the jungles of the Americas, let's establish what it actually takes to build a world wonder, starting with that amputation survivor at Giza.
Yeah, let's talk about the physical costs.
Because I always assumed, like I think most people do, that the pyramids were built by slave labor.
Well, for centuries, that was the assumption. I mean, it was popularized by ancient Greek historians like Herodotus, who visited long after the pyramids were built.
Right, and then Hollywood cemented it.
Exactly. But the bioarchaeological evidence from our journal completely rewrites that script. Back in 1990, archaeologists actually discovered the workers' cemetery at Giza.
And this dates back to, what, roughly 2613 to 2494 BCE?
Roughly, yeah. And when researchers actually analyzed the skeletal pathology, basically the medical history written into the bones of the people buried there, they found a very different reality.
So they weren't looking at the bones of disposable captives.
No, they were looking at the bones of a highly valued, state-supported workforce.
Oh, wow.
Now, make no mistake, the skeletal evidence does reveal that these people were subjected to extreme, punishing physical labor.
I mean, moving limestone blocks that weigh 2.5 tons each without machinery. You're essentially asking the human spine to do the job of a forklift.
Right, the biomechanical stress was immense. The researchers found pervasive evidence of lumbar compression fractures.
Which is what happens when the lower back is subjected to catastrophic weight, right?
Exactly. Repeated heavy lifting physically compresses the vertebrae. They also found severe degenerative joint disease and osteoarthritis in the knees, hips, and shoulders.
So they were definitely working themselves to the bone. Literally.
Literally. But, and here's the key. The bones also showed widespread evidence of healed fractures.
Wait, healed? Like they got medical treatment?
Yes. We're talking about broken arms, legs, and ribs that had fully mended. One skeleton had a healed femur fracture with a 15-degree angular deformity.
Ouch. That would have caused a severe limp.
It would have. But the person survived it. And as you mentioned in the intro, they found at least 2 instances of surgical amputations where the bone ends had healed.
That is just wild to me.
It means the patient survived the operation, avoided fatal infection, and lived for months or years afterward.
Hold on. If you're a brutal dictator using disposable slave labor, you don't perform a complex surgical amputation, manage the risk of infection, and feed someone for months while their femur knits back together.
No, you don't.
You just replace them. It's like finding out an ancient construction crew had better workers' comp and state-sponsored health care than some modern gig workers.
That's a great way to put it, and that is the crucial insight here. Investing in healthcare for skilled stoneworkers wasn't an act of charity.
It was an economic calculation.
Exactly, a cold economic calculation. You don't throw away a trained artisan. The journal points out that replacing an injured, highly skilled craftsman was actually more expensive than treating him.
So if this wasn't slavery, what was it?
It was a state-organized corvée labor system.
Okay, can you explain the corvée system? Like, how does that actually function on a national scale?
A corvée is essentially a labor tax. So during the Nile's inundation period, roughly July through October, the river flooded the agricultural fields.
Making it physically impossible to farm.
Right. You suddenly had a massive population of farmers who had nothing to do. The state conscripted that idle labor force, brought them to Giza, and in exchange for their grueling work, provisioned them.
And from what I read in the source, they weren't just throwing scraps to these workers.
Far from it. The animal bones found in the worker settlement show a diet rich in prime-age cattle.
Prime beef. Not just the old draft animals that drop dead.
Exactly. They weren't eating the tough, worn-out animals. They were eating premium beef, sheep, and goats provisioned from estates across the entire country.
The logistics of that alone are staggering. And we actually have a written record of this, right? The journal discusses something called the Wadi al-Jarf Papyri.
Yes, specifically the Merer logbook. This is honestly one of the most incredible archaeological discoveries of the 21st century.
It's basically an ancient middle manager's spreadsheet, isn't it?
It really is. It's a real-time bureaucratic record written by an overseer named Merer.
So if you've ever managed a massive spreadsheet for a corporate project, you have a 4,500-year-old kindred spirit in Merer.
Totally. He was managing a work gang transporting limestone from the Tura quarries across the river to Giza.
And his logbook isn't some agonizing tale of suffering.
Not at all. It's a logistical spreadsheet. He's noting wind delays, tracking bread and beer distributions, and naming his work gangs things like the Friends of Khufu.
Friends of Khufu. That sounds like a bowling team.
Right. It just highlights the sheer administrative sophistication of the Egyptian state.
To build a monument of that scale, the invisible infrastructure of logistics, food supply chains, and medical care is just as monumental as the physical stone itself.
Completely. You can't have one without the other.
So if we transition from the sands of Egypt across the globe to the jungles of the Americas, we see the Maya building staggering monuments of their own.
Yes, incredible structures.
But they had a massive handicap compared to the Egyptians.
Wow.
They didn't have the Nile River to move stone, they didn't have wheeled vehicles, and they didn't have large draft animals like oxen.
Right, no beasts of burden.
Every single ounce of their cities was moved by human muscle.
And yet, the underlying mechanism of labor mobilization is strikingly similar, even without those technological aids.
How so?
Well, the Wikipedia source on Maya architecture details their building process. They utilize the geographically abundant local limestone, which is relatively soft when you first quarry it.
So it's easier to cut initially.
Exactly. It's easier to carve with stone tools before it hardens upon exposure to the air.
But how did they actually build up? Because they didn't use the true arch like the Romans did. I was reading about this concept called the core-belled arch, and I'm a little fuzzy on the mechanics.
Okay, so the true arch uses wedge-shaped stones that lock together at the top with a keystone, right, that distributes weight outward and downward.
Right.
The Maya use the core-belled arch, which is different. Imagine stacking blocks on top of each other, but every time you add a new layer, you slide it slightly inward toward the center.
So it's more like an overlapping staircase that meets in the middle.
That's a perfect way to visualize it. You keep stepping the walls inward until they are close enough at the top to be bridged by a single flat capstone.
But that doesn't seem as structurally sound as a Roman arch.
It's not. Because a core-belled arch can't support as much weight as a true arch, the walls supporting it have to be incredibly thick, and the interior rooms end up being quite narrow.
Ah, that makes sense.
Interestingly, they often design these high vaulted stone ceilings specifically to mimic the appearance and feel of a simple Maya thatched hut.
Wait, really? They modeled massive stone temples after simple huts.
Yeah. They were taking the basic architectural vocabulary of their daily lives and scaling it up into colossal stone temples.
Which means they needed an immense, highly organized workforce to quarry the limestone, transport it on their backs, using tump lines, which are straps that go across the forehead to bear weight, right?
Yes, exactly.
So,
Tump lines distribute the weight to the neck and spine.
And then assemble it all. So just like at Giza, when you look at an ancient Maya monument, you shouldn't just see the stone.
No, you must visualize the vast, deeply organized human logistical apparatus. They had to feed, manage, and organize tens of thousands of people in a dense jungle environment.
That is such a powerful takeaway for you as a listener. The next time you look at a world wonder, don't just marvel at the engineering. Marvel at the supply chain.
Yeah.
Because the flesh and blood logistics are the real miracle.
Absolutely. The bureaucracy is the unseen wonder.
But this brings up a huge question for me. If the logistics of building a massive city are incredibly complex, when did societies actually figure this out?
That's the million-dollar question in archaeology.
Because my understanding was always that the Maya civilization peaked relatively late, right around the time the Roman Empire was falling.
That was the established academic narrative for a very long time. The traditional model divided Maya history into three parts: the pre-classic, the classic, and the post-classic.
Okay.
The assumption was that the pre-classic period, anything before 250 CE, was just a formative phase.
Like a warm-up.
Yeah, it was viewed almost as a developmental infancy, a long, slow rehearsal period where scattered villages were just figuring out agriculture and basic pottery before the big show of the classic period.
But the journal article by Bindu PS completely shatters that timeline.
It really does.
Let's talk about the pre-classic surprise at a site called El Mirador. Because when I read the dimensions of what they built during the supposed rehearsal phase, I honestly thought it was a typo.
A lot of archaeologists felt the same way when the data first came out. El Mirador is located in the dense peatland basin of northern Guatemala, and it forces us to completely rewrite the timeline of urban complexity.
When was it built?
It dates to the late pre-classic, roughly 600 BCE to 150 CE, and the scale of construction is almost incomprehensible for that era.
I want to paint a picture of the La Danta Pyramid at El Mirador for everyone. La Danta is 72 meters high. That's over 230 feet.
It's massive.
But it's the total volume that is staggering, 2.8 million cubic meters. It is one of the most massive ancient buildings on planet Earth by sheer bulk.
And they built this hundreds of years before the classic period even started.
Right. How is that possible during a formative phase?
It proves it wasn't formative. The level of state complexity required to execute that is profound. And importantly, our sources show El Mirador wasn't an isolated anomaly.
There were others.
Yes. The journal notes Takeshi Inomata's discovery at a site called Siebel, where they found formal ceremonial E-groups dating all the way back to 1000 BCE.
Wow.
We also have the San Bartolo murals, dated to around 100 BCE, which show fully developed royal iconography.
Right. I remember the murals showing the maize god, the principal bird deity, and scenes of a king being crowned.
Which means the entire ideological apparatus of divine kingship was already fully locked in. They had already developed the religious justification for mobilizing that corvée labor.
And they applied it to their infrastructure as well.
Yeah.
They built the Can Kingdom causeway system, didn't they?
Yes, these raised limestone roads called Sacbiob, they connected El Mirador to neighboring cities like Nakbi and Tintal. It was a fully integrated, engineered urban network.
What fascinates me is why they built these specific shapes. Like, La Danta isn't just a big triangle. It's a triadic pyramid.
Right, meaning it has a massive central platform with 3 separate structures on top.
Yeah. Why 3?
This represents an intense focus on mapping their ideology onto the physical environment. The triadic pyramid wasn't just an aesthetic choice. It represented the 3 hearthstones of Maya creation mythology.
Oh, like a cosmic fireplace.
Basically, yeah. They believed the gods set 3 stones in the sky to create the universe. By building these triadic structures, the rulers were physically embedding their cosmic order into the landscape.
And to feed the estimated 100,000 people living in this basin, they had to engineer the landscape even further. They utilized the bejos.
The bejos are seasonal swamps. For a long time, archaeologists thought these swamps were dead zones.
But they weren't.
No. The pre-classic Maya developed huge raised field agricultural systems within them. They would dig muck and nutrient-rich soil out of the swamp channels and pile it up to create elevated, highly fertile planting beds.
That is genius. But there is a very dark side to all this ambition at El Mirador.
There is a very dark side.
They built the biggest pyramids, they engineered the swamps, they connected the cities, and then around 150 CE, it completely collapsed. The city was abandoned.
Completely empty.
What broke the system? Because they clearly had the food and the labor figured out.
It was a catastrophic environmental failure. And the tragedy is it was driven largely by their own aesthetic choices.
Aesthetic choices. Wait, what do you mean?
Well, to make these monuments visually spectacular, to make them shine in the jungle sun, the Maya covered them in smooth, white limestone plaster, or stucco.
And here's where we need to explain the chemistry, because this blew my mind.
Oh.
You don't just dig plaster out of the ground.
No, you have to manufacture it. To create quicklime for stucco, you must take raw limestone and heat it to roughly 900 degrees Celsius.
That's incredibly hot.
In a world without coal or industrial furnaces, the only way to achieve and maintain that temperature is by burning massive amounts of green wood.
And the ratio required is just brutal, isn't it?
Producing 1 ton of quicklime requires burning up to 20 tons of firewood.
A 20-to-1 ratio.
Yeah.
So every time they wanted to plaster a massive pyramid like La Danta, which is 2.8 million cubic meters of surface area, they had to clear-cut entire forests.
Thousands and thousands of acres.
Okay, let's unpack this. It's as if to paint your living room walls, you had to cut down every single tree in a 5-mile radius just to fuel the paint mixer.
That is a chillingly accurate analogy.
They were victims of their own conspicuous consumption.
Yeah.
The sheer caloric cost of their aesthetics is what killed them.
Exactly. The deforestation across the Mirador Basin was absolute. And when you strip the forest canopy in a tropical environment, you destabilize the local hydrology.
Because the tree roots aren't holding the soil anymore.
Right. So when the heavy seasonal rains come, that topsoil violently erodes. It washes down into the bajos.
Oh, no.
Those elaborate, carefully engineered, raised field agricultural systems we just talked about. They get choked with sterile silt, agricultural productivity plummets, the food supply crashes, and the population starves or flees.
They were essentially burning down their own habitable environment just to make their buildings look perfectly white and smooth.
It's a profound example of a society prioritizing short-term ideological display over long-term ecological stability.
That's sobering.
Really sobering. And it reveals a recurring structural vulnerability in tropical urbanism. The Maya didn't just have one single linear rise and fall narrative. They experienced cycles of massive expansion followed by severe ecological exhaustion.
So El Mirador was just the first great cycle.
Exactly.
But that cyclical nature actually leads us into how the Maya conceptualized their world, because they didn't view time as a straight line from birth to death like we usually do.
No, their concept of time was radically different.
To truly understand these monuments, we have to look at the Smithsonian and Mesoweb sources and break down their absolute obsession with astronomical and cyclical time.
Time for the Maya was a complex, interlocking set of gears. It was an endless cycle of returning energies. The mathematical and observational sophistication of their calendar systems remains one of their greatest intellectual achievements.
I was looking at the calendar section in the sources, and honestly, it made my head spin. It looks like a giant, terrifying clock. Can you walk me through how they actually calculated a year?
Sure. Let's break down the gears of this cosmic clock. You essentially have two main calendars running simultaneously.
Yep.
First, you have the Hab. This is basically the solar calendar. It is 365 days long, which approximates the solar year. But it's structured quite differently than ours.
How so?
It consists of 18 months, and each month has exactly 20 days.
Okay, quick math. 18 times 20 is 360. What about the other 5 days?
Those remaining 5 days are placed at the very end of the year in a short month called the Way Up.
The way up. What happened during those 5 days?
Well, the Wabe was traditionally considered a very dangerous liminal period where the normal order of the world was suspended. The boundaries between the human world and the underworld grew thin.
That sounds intense.
It was. It required specific ceremonies, fasting, and rituals to ensure the universe didn't literally unravel.
Okay, so that's the 365-day solar gear. What's the second gear?
The second smaller gear is the Tzolk'in, the sacred calendar. This one is 260 days long.
260 days.
Right. And it's not divided into months at all. Instead, it's created by continuously matching a sequence of numbers from 1 to 13 with a sequence of 20 distinct named dayglyphs like Imix, Ek, Akbal, and so on.
Kind of like a deck of cards.
A bit, yeah. Because 13 and 20 share no common denominator. A specific number and a specific name will only pair up once every 260 days.
But why 260? I mean, the solar year makes sense for seasons, but 260 seems totally arbitrary.
It seems that way to us, but it's deeply grounded in biology and agriculture. The Smithsonian source points out that 260 days beautifully matches the human gestation period, roughly 9 months.
Oh, wow, I hadn't thought of that.
It also perfectly frames the growing cycle of corn in the highlands. Furthermore, the zenith passage of the sun, when the sun crosses directly overhead at the latitude of southern Mesoamerica, occurs at intervals of 260 days and 105 days.
So their sacred time was intimately tied to human life, agricultural survival, and the physical movement of the sun.
Completely integrated.
Now, here is where it gets really mathematical. You have the 365-day Hob gear and the 260-day Tzolk'in gear meshing together, right?
Yes.
So every single day has a designation in both calendars.
Yes. A day might be 4 Ajah in the Tzolk'in and 8 Kumku in the Hob. If you advance both calendars day by day, that specific combination of 4 Aja 8 Kunku will not repeat until exactly 52 solar years have passed.
And this 52-year cycle is known as the calendar round.
Precisely, the calendar round.
I love the calendar round. I like to compare reaching 52 in the calendar round to a modern midlife crisis, except it's the exact opposite.
How do you mean?
Well, for us, turning 50 is often when people buy a sports car and panic about aging. But for the Maya, surviving a complete 52-year term of the cosmic years was a massive achievement. You finally attained the special wisdom of an elder, and the whole universe essentially celebrated your survival.
That's a lovely way to look at it. And it was a moment of profound cosmic renewal for them. All fires in the city would be extinguished and ritually relit.
Really? All the fires?
Yes. In fact, many temples and pyramids were physically remodeled or had new layers built over them in 52-year cycles to mark this temporal reset.
But if they wanted to record history that went back hundreds or thousands of years, a 52-year cycle isn't long enough. You'd get confused about which 52-year cycle an event happened in.
Exactly. For historical events that spanned much longer periods, they needed a bigger yardstick. That's the long count.
The long count.
The long count is a base 20 chronological system used for dating mythic and historical events. It measures days sequentially from a mythological creation date.
And when was that date?
It corresponds to August 11, 3114 BCE in our Gregorian calendar.
Wait, this is the calendar that caused a global panic back in 2012, right? People thought the Maya predicted the end of the world.
Right, the 2012 phenomenon. That was because one of its major cycles, the 13th Bacton, which is a period of roughly 394 years, completed and reset on December 21st, 2012.
So it wasn't the end of the world at all.
No, it was simply the rolling over of an odometer.
You know, on the cover of the Introduction to Maya Hieroglyph Source, there's this incredible visual of two elite figures facing each other, deep in conversation, interacting right over a stack of glyphs.
It's a striking image.
It perfectly illustrates that for the Maya, mastering time and writing wasn't just record-keeping. The rulers who controlled the calendar controlled the planting seasons, the festivals, and the connection to the gods.
Time was political power.
And they built that power directly into the stone, didn't they? They didn't just track time on paper bark codices or carved stelae. They constructed massive architectural clocks.
Oh, absolutely. The Wikipedia source details the E-groups, like the famous one at Waxacton.
Can you explain how an E-group physically works?
An E-group is a specific architectural complex designed for astronomical observation. You stand on a Western pyramid and look across a plaza at 3 structures arranged on a single Eastern platform.
Okay, so you're looking east.
Right. If you stand there on the summer solstice, the sun rises exactly over the northernmost structure. On the winter solstice, it rises over the southernmost structure.
And on the equinoxes.
It rises perfectly over the central structure. The buildings are a fixed compass and clock.
But the ultimate flex of combining time and architecture has to be El Castillo at Chichen Itza.
Oh, without a doubt. It is the absolute masterpiece of calendrical architecture.
Explain the math on that one, because it's brilliant.
So El Castillo is a radial pyramid, meaning it has 4 stairways. Each of those 4 stairways has exactly 91 steps. If you multiply 91 by 4, you get 364.
Plus the top platform.
Right. Add the top platform as the final step, and that totals exactly 365 steps.
The precise number of days in the Hob calendar.
Exactly.
But it does something even more spectacular with the sun, doesn't it?
It does. During the spring and autumn equinoxes, as the sun sets, the angle of the light projects the shadow of the pyramid-stepped terraces onto the northern balustrade.
And what does it look like?
It creates the illusion of a massive, undulating serpent of light and shadow winding its way down the steps. And it perfectly joins up with the massive carved stone snakeheads at the base of the stairs.
That is just chillingly perfect design.
It really is.
So, to you listening, I invite you to just imagine this. Imagine living in a city where your architecture isn't just shelter. Your buildings themselves function as a giant communal clock. Your daily life, your agricultural schedule, your religious festivals, they are all physically linked to the movement of the cosmos by the stones you walk past every single day.
It is a level of environmental and cosmic integration that is very difficult for a modern urbanite to fully grasp.
Which brings us perfectly to our 2026 travel guide source. Because how do we modern urbanites interact with these cosmic monuments today?
This is a fascinating lens.
The guide does a direct comparison between 2 radically different Maya experiences. The classic jungle immersion of Tikal versus the terminal classic precision of Chichen Itza.
It really highlights how modern tourism infrastructure profoundly shapes our understanding of the past.
Let's look at Tikal first, located in the P10 region of Guatemala. This is a classic period site, meaning it represents the absolute peak of Maya civilization before the 9th century collapse.
And the setting is incredible.
The 2026 guide describes it as 16 square kilometers of wild, pristine jungle, over 3,000 structures. And the crucial detail here for the adventurous traveler, you can still climb the temples.
But the physical reality of doing so is intense.
Oh, massive effort. The guide is very clear. We're talking about an 8 to 12 kilometer hike in severe heat and 70 to 90% humidity.
You're really earning it.
You are scaling wooden staircases built up the sides of these 60 or 70 degree inclines to reach the top of Temple de Feith, which is 65 meters high. You're dripping sweat, and you're surrounded by the incredibly aggressive, terrifying roar of howler monkeys and the calls of toucans.
It is an absolute assault on the senses.
But budget-wise, it's accessible for backpackers. A $24 entrance fee, plus an $8 to $12 shuttle from the nearby island town of Flores.
Now, contrast that sensory experience with Chichen Itza in the northern Yucatan Peninsula of Mexico. Chichen Itza represents a later era, the terminal classic and post-classic periods.
Architecturally, it's entirely different.
Entirely. You see heavy Toltec influence from central Mexico, extensive colonnaded halls, reclining shackmul figures used for offerings, and feathered serpents everywhere.
And the visitor experience is night and day compared to Tikal.
How does guide describe it?
The guide notes that Chichen Itza is manicured, the ground is flat, and it is highly curated. It receives 2.5 to 3 million visitors a year. During peak season, you are sharing that flat limestone plain with up to 12,000 people a day.
Wow, and the physical interaction with the monument has been severed.
Exactly. Climbing was completely banned in 2006 for preservation and safety reasons.
Which is completely understandable given the volume of people.
Yeah, you cannot walk up El Castillo. You observe it from the ground behind a rope. The entrance is roughly $27, but the overall cost of the trip is significantly higher because you're usually accessing it via expensive air-conditioned tour buses from luxury resort areas like Cancun.
What is archaeologically significant here is what these two sites represent about the Maya timeline.
Right, they represent totally different phases.
Tikal shows you the pure, monumental scale of the classic Maya, deeply embedded in an untamed rainforest ecosystem. It's a society trying to conquer the jungle.
And Chichen Itza.
Chichen Itza shows you a society in transition, moving away from the deep jungle, adapting to a drier climate, and synthesizing with foreign central Mexican cultures on a flat plain.
Our modern preferences entirely dictate our interaction with this history. Tikal is for the Indiana Jones traveler. You want to suffer a little bit, you want to earn your view, you want to feel the jungle heat.
And Chichen Itza.
Chichen Itza, on the other hand, is like the curated Louvre of Mesoamerica. It's highly accessible, it's flawless, you can see it on a day trip from a beach resort, but you are experiencing it alongside thousands of other tourists.
They serve very different educational and personal priorities.
So to the listener, which traveler are you? Would you rather battle humidity and climb steep wooden steps for a quiet, monkey-filled sunrise over the jungle canopy?
Or would you rather navigate crowds of 10,000 people to witness perfect, restored architectural geometry and get back to your resort by dinner?
It's a tough choice, but we have to address the elephant in the room regarding Tikal.
The collapse.
Yes. Yeah, Tikal represents the breathtaking height of the classic period. It was a thriving metropolis.
Yeah.
Yet by the year 1000 CE, those incredible, sprawling southern lowland cities, including Tikal, Copan, and Palenque, were largely abandoned.
The divine kings vanished, the populations dispersed, and the jungle reclaimed the pyramids.
The famous Maya collapse. Why did the music stop? They clearly didn't burn down their forests for stucco this time, because they had learned from El Mirador.
Right, they were more careful with the plaster.
To answer this, let's dive into the megadrought controversy from our journal, written by Begina M.
This is such a crucial piece of the puzzle. For a long time, the collapse was a blank canvas for wild speculation. People proposed peasant revolts, mysterious plagues, even alien abduction.
Oh, I've heard all the theories.
But over the last 3 decades, high-resolution paleoclimatic data has brought the picture into sharp, terrifying focus. Between 800 and 1000 CE, the region experienced the most severe megadroughts in 2,000 years.
Wait, how does a scientist in the 21st century know that it didn't rain on a Tuesday 1,000 years ago? How do you actually prove a drought from a millennium ago?
You use environmental proxies.
Proxies, like stand-ins?
Exactly. The journal details 3 massive, interlocking pieces of chemical evidence. First, scientists drilled core samples from the bottom of Lake Chichen.
And what did they find in the mud?
They found thick bands of a mineral called gypsum deposited exactly during the 9th and 10th centuries.
Okay, what does gypsum tell us?
Gypsum only precipitates and falls to the bottom of a lake when the water evaporates heavily due to a severe lack of rain.
Okay, so the lakes were drying up. What's the second proxy?
Titanium in the Cariaco Basin Marine Corps off the coast of Venezuela.
Titanium, how does that relate to rain?
When heavy tropical rains fall, they wash terrestrial soil, which contains titanium, into the rivers, which then dump it into the sea. If you drill into the ocean floor and find layers with very low titanium, it means there was very little rain washing dirt into the ocean.
Wow, that is incredibly clever. And the third one is the most specific, right? Stalagmites.
Yes, they analyzed oxygen isotopes in a stalagmite from Yok Balloon Cave in Belize.
How does a cave rock record rainfall?
As water drips into a cave and forms a stalagmite over centuries, it traps oxygen from the rainwater. The ratio of heavy oxygen 18 to light oxygen 16 changes based on evaporation.
Oh, because lighter oxygen evaporates faster.
Exactly. When it's dry, the lighter oxygen evaporates away, leaving a higher concentration of heavy oxygen 18 in the dripping water. By measuring these isotopes layer by millimeter layer, scientists created a year-by-year record of rainfall.
And all 3 proxies point to the same thing.
All 3 aligned perfectly. Between 800 and 1000 CE, the rain stopped.
Which led to what the journal calls the monocausal drought thesis, championed by Richardson Gill.
Yes, the monocausal theory.
His argument was brutally simple. When the rains failed, the agricultural base failed. Everyone starved, and the civilization collapsed. Case closed. Drought killed the Maya.
But the expert consensus in the journal pushes back very hard on this simplistic view. Scholars like B.L. Turner, Jeremy Sabloff, and Lisa Lucero warn against the monocausal fallacy.
I completely agree with them. If the drought was the only thing that mattered, and the paleoclimatic data shows the drought hit the whole region, why did the northern cities like Chichen Itza actually thrive during this exact same 800 to 1000 CE window?
That is the big glaring hole in Gill's theory.
Right. If everyone was dying of thirst, how is Chichen Itza mobilizing the labor to build El Castillo at the exact same time?
That is the exact contradiction that breaks the monocausal theory. Drought alone does not wipe out a complex civilization. The Maya had survived severe droughts before.
So what was different this time?
The terminal classic collapse was a compound event. The answer lies in the intersection of climate, ecology, and rigid political institutions.
How so? Like, what actually broke?
Lisa Lucero's model is particularly insightful here. In the southern lowlands, around cities like Tikal, there are very few natural lakes or rivers.
So they relied entirely on rainwater.
Yes. The elite rulers staked their entire political legitimacy on their ability to control water. They engineered massive plastered surface reservoirs in the center of their cities to capture the seasonal rains.
And they claimed they were responsible for that rain.
Yes. The kings claimed a direct divine connection to the rain god, Chayak. They performed the bloodletting rituals that supposedly brought the rain.
I see where this is going.
So when the megadroughts hit and those massive surface reservoirs dried up into cracked mud, they didn't just lose drinking water.
They lost their divine mandate.
Exactly. The kings were exposed as frauds. The psychological contract between the ruler and the ruled was broken.
And when political legitimacy evaporates right along with the water, what happens next?
Panic. It led to what anthropologist David Webster calls hyper-militarism. Instead of cooperating to manage the crisis, cities turned on each other in a desperate scramble for diminishing resources.
The journal highlights the Dos Pialistical conflict, where a satellite city turned on its founder, sparking decades of devastating regional warfare.
They were burning each other's fields while the rain refused to fall. It was self-destructive.
Furthermore, the landscape was already incredibly stressed, wasn't it?
Highly stressed. The southern lowlands had been intensively farmed and deforested for centuries to support huge populations. The soils were degraded.
So when the megadroughts hit, they fell on a system that had already been weakened by its own success. Massive overpopulation and internal warfare.
It was a perfect storm.
So what did the North do differently? How did Chichen Itza survive this systemic shock?
2 critical adaptations: geography and governance. First, the geography of the northern Yucatan is different. It's a flat limestone shelf, dotted with cenotes.
Cenotes are those deep, natural sinkholes, right?
Yes, they tap directly into the massive underground groundwater table. These cenotes were vastly more drought-resistant than the artificial surface reservoirs of the South. Even in a drought, the cenotes still had water at the bottom.
Okay, so that solves the water problem. What about governance?
Chichen Itza seems to have moved away from the cult of the single divine king.
Really? Who is in charge then?
They utilized a multi-pol system, which is a council-based form of governance. They distributed power among several noble houses and elite factions.
So when a crisis hit, you didn't have one divine figure at the top taking all the blame and getting overthrown.
Exactly. Decision-making was shared, the political system was flexible and resilient.
The Maya didn't disappear. They reorganized. They abandoned the rigid, failing systems of the South and migrated to the coast and the North, integrating into new, flexible systems.
Which is a huge distinction from simply collapsing.
The lesson here isn't that societies hit by climate change are doomed to fail. The lesson is that survival depends entirely on the resilience, the flexibility, and the adaptability of our institutions.
Environmental stress is the trigger, but the human institutional response determines the outcome.
And that idea of resilience and adaptation leads us perfectly into our final section. Because when a system faces a shock, you don't just have to migrate. Sometimes you survive by reaching outward.
By connecting with others.
Exactly. Let's pull in our final 2 journal articles, which focus on Asia. These sources show how cultures survived and thrived not by walling themselves off, but by synthesizing and trading.
This is where we get into the maritime Silk Road.
Yeah, let's talk about that, because when we hear Silk Road, we usually imagine camel caravans trekking slowly across the Central Asian deserts.
But between 200 and 1400 CE, the Indian Ocean sustained an incredibly active, massive maritime trade network.
And this network was driven entirely by a brilliant understanding of the seasonal monsoon winds.
Yes, they used the winds as a predictable engine for trade.
Let's talk about the Belitung shipwreck, because it completely changes how we view pre-modern global trade. This was discovered off the coast of Indonesia and dates to about 826 CE.
By the way, that is right in the middle of the Maya megadroughts we just discussed.
That's a crazy coincidence. While tikal was collapsing, global trade in the Indian Ocean was booming.
The Belitung wreck was an Arab dhow. And what's fascinating about a dhow is how it's built.
How so?
It doesn't use iron nails. The planks of the hull are literally sewn together using coconut husk fiber called coir.
Sewn together, like with giant thread.
Basically, yes. It makes the ship flexible enough to absorb the shock of heavy waves without shattering.
But it's not the ship itself that's so shocking. It's what was inside it. The cargo hold contained an astonishing 60,000 mass-produced Chinese changsha bowls.
60,000 in the 9th century.
I always thought mass production started with the Industrial Revolution.
It completely upends our timeline of industrialization. The changsha kilns in China operated on an industrial scale, churning out identical ceramics specifically designed for foreign export markets in the Middle East and Southeast Asia.
But Delia Varghese' article in the journal points out something even more profound about the Southeast Asian port cities, places like Srivijaya in Sumatra, or the chieftaincies in the Philippines.
Right, they weren't just pit stops for Arab and Chinese merchants.
And they were not passive consumers, just gratefully accepting advanced foreign goods. They were active agents, manipulating the global economy for their own local benefit.
Exactly. They controlled the strategic straits, like the Strait of Malacca, taxing the shipments and demanding trade concessions.
And I loved the specific example from the Philippines. The local chieftains imported these incredibly fine Chinese celadon ceramics, but they didn't just use them as nice dishes for dinner.
What did they do with them?
They repurposed them as prestige goods in elaborate burial rites. A Chinese bowl became a political tool. By burying a relative with a hoard of foreign ceramics, the chief was physically demonstrating a message to his rivals.
Look at my global connections. Look at my immense wealth.
Exactly. I command resources from across the ocean. Respect my authority. They repurposed a foreign trade good to serve their local political reality.
Which is the very definition of cultural synthesis. They take an external input and weave it into the local fabric of power.
And we see an equally powerful, perhaps even more intimate example of this in the final article by Sajir S., which looks at Himalayan religious syncretism in pre-colonial Arunachal Pradesh, roughly between 800 and 1826 CE.
We are going from the ocean to the highest mountains in the world.
Yes. During this period, the major Tibetan Buddhist monastic traditions specifically the Gelugpa and Nyingmapa sects, were expanding southward into the Himalayas.
They established massive administrative and religious centers, the most prominent being the Tawang Monastery, founded around 1680.
Now, historically, when a massive, highly organized, state-backed religion moves into a territory inhabited by indigenous tribes, it is almost always a story of violent erasure.
Right, the big religion crushes the local beliefs, burns their shrines, and forces conversion.
But the journal highlights that this isn't what happened here.
It wasn't an erasure, it was an ongoing negotiation.
The territory was inhabited by communities like the Monpa and the Sherdukpen. These groups practiced indigenous animist traditions, such as Doña Polo, which centered on the worship of the sun and moon, and a deep reverence for local mountain and forest spirits.
So how did these two radically different worldviews interact?
The local communities actively negotiated the encounter. They didn't just passively submit to Tibetan Buddhism, they selectively appropriated Buddhist elements while fiercely retaining the core of their own rituals.
The journal gives a brilliant physical example regarding prayer flags, doesn't it?
This is fascinating. In Orthodox Tibetan Buddhism, prayer flags are inscribed with sacred texts. You hang them up, and as the wind blows, the wind reads the text and releases the blessings and mantras into the universe.
It's a way of spreading compassion.
But the Monpa community repurposed them entirely. They adopted the physical flags, but they didn't use them to spread mantras to the universe.
What do they use them for?
In their animist belief system, the forests were inhabited by potentially dangerous local spirits. So the Monpa took the Buddhist prayer flags and hung them around their villages as protective boundary markers.
They essentially created a magical fence to ward off indigenous forest spirits?
Exactly. They took a Buddhist tool for universal compassion and turned it into an animist spiritual security system.
It's like a modern cultural mashup. You don't erase the local flavor, you just remix the audio.
And the Sherdukpen community took it even further during their Luzar festival, which is the New Year celebration.
Yes, the Sherdukpen literally maintained a dual religious system. During Luzar, you would have Gelugpa Buddhist monks chanting their sutras and performing Orthodox rituals.
And right alongside them, in the exact same festival space, the indigenous Jiji priests were performing animal blood sacrifices and invoking local spirits.
Wait, blood sacrifice is strictly forbidden in Orthodox Buddhism.
Exactly. Yet they were working parallel shifts in the same festival.
How did the powerful Tawang Monastery allow this?
Because the Tibetan monastic authorities were highly pragmatic. Their primary goal was political and economic stability, not necessarily theological purity.
As long as the local communities paid their taxes, provided labor, and formally acknowledged the overarching political authority of the monastery, the monks tolerated this hybridity.
It perfectly proves that syncretism isn't just confusion, and it isn't an incomplete or failed conversion. It is an active, highly creative strategy.
Human beings survive by adapting external pressures, whether that's a foreign religion, a global trade network, or a changing climate into their local realities.
That is the defining characteristic of human resilience.
It really is.
So let's tie this entire deep dive together. We have traveled a massive physical and chronological distance today.
We covered a lot of ground.
We started in the blistering heat of Giza, looking at the corvée labor camps, the logistical spreadsheets, and the healed bones of the workers who sacrificed their spines to stack 2-ton stones.
We moved to the deforested, suffocating swamps of El Mirador, where the pre-classic Maya burned their own ecosystem to the ground for the sake of white plaster.
We decoded the massive interlocking gears of the Maya calendar. We scaled the wild, monkey-filled temples of Tikal and contrasted that with the manicured, cosmic clockwork of Chichen Itza.
We tracked the oxygen isotopes that prove the mega droughts, and we saw how rigid political systems collapse while flexible ones adapt.
Finally, we sailed the monsoon winds of the Indian Ocean with 60,000 mass-produced ceramic bowls and watched Himalayan tribes creatively weave Orthodox Buddhist mantras into their animist forest magic.
Every single one of these stories is a profound testament to human ambition and our desperate, relentless drive to organize and survive.
And here is the so what for you listening right now. Every concrete structure you walk past today, every global supply chain that brings a package to your door, and every cultural tradition you practice or observe.
It is all the result of thousands of years of human beings trying to organize their labor, trying to survive their changing environments, and trying to make sense of the stars.
The technology changes, but the underlying hardware of human ambition is exactly the same.
We are still building monuments, we are still trading across oceans, and we are still struggling to adapt to a changing climate.
Exactly. Which leaves me with one final, slightly provocative thought for you to mull over. We spent the last hour talking about what the ancient world left behind in the dirt and the stone.
The physical legacy.
Right. The Egyptians left pyramids. The Maya left limestone temples and eroded swamps. The Belitung shipwreck left 60,000 ceramic bowls at the bottom of the sea.
So what are we leaving?
Consider the monuments we are building today. Our most massive monuments are increasingly digital. We are building massive server farms, sprawling data centers, the vast infrastructure of the cloud.
That's a really interesting point.
If the bioarchaeologists of the year 5000 dig up the remains of our civilization, what are they going to find in the physical footprint of our digital clouds?
It takes physical resources to run the cloud.
Will our technological footprint look like the Giza project? A highly organized state-sponsored corvée labor system that calculated the value of its workers? Or will it look exactly like El Mirador?
A society conspicuously consuming massive amounts of water and energy, burning down its own environment just to keep the facade running.
Exactly. Will our archaeological diagnostic X-ray look clean, or will it be muddy? Something for you to mull over.
A great question to end on.
Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the source material. We will catch you next time. Imagine you are holding a kaleidoscope of history right in your hands.
Oh, I like that visual.
Yeah, and like when you look through it, you expect to see this one clear, distinct image, right? A civilization rising, hitting its peak, and then, as the traditional story always goes, just mysteriously vanishing into the jungle mist.
Right, the classic disappearing act.
Exactly. But when you twist the lens on this one, that single image just fractures. It shatters into hundreds of these brilliant, sharp, distinct pieces that absolutely refuse to disappear.
They really do. They just rearrange themselves.
Yeah, they adapt, they survive. So welcome to the deep dive. You, the listener, are the third person in the room with us today. And our mission here is to basically shatter a very persistent, very pervasive myth.
A huge myth.
Right. The myth that the ancient Maya simply vanished after their so-called classic period collapse.
It's a myth that has captured the popular imagination for well over a century now, but it fundamentally misunderstands how civilizations actually function.
Right, and how people survive.
Exactly how human beings adapt to catastrophe. So what we are going to explore today is how the fragmentation of the Maya identity wasn't some, symptom of their demise.
It was actually the opposite, right?
Yes, it became their greatest weapon against total annihilation. We are looking at this absolute masterclass in what anthropologists call cultural domestication.
Cultural domestication. I love that term.
It's fascinating. It's how the Maya survived, not just by, fighting back on a literal battlefield, but by quietly absorbing, bending, and transforming their invaders' culture from the inside out.
And to unpack all of this, we are drawing on a really impressive stack of dense, rich sources today.
We've got a lot of ground to cover.
We really do. First up, we've got Georges Ferry's historical analysis, which is called 1527-1901, The Struggle for Freedom in the Yucatan.
A very heavy, detailed read.
Oh, absolutely. And we are pairing that with Ulf Lewin's deeply researched cultural anthropology master's thesis, Mayaness Through Time, which kind of bridges the ancient past with the modern era.
And then to round out the whole timeline, we are bringing in this really comprehensive encyclopedia entry detailing the entire timeline of the Spanish conquest of the Maya.
So yeah, it is a vast amount of material. We're covering literally thousands of years of history today.
Moving from the very earliest archaic settlements all the way up to 21st century political activism.
Which is wild to think about. But the thread connecting it all is this incredible, almost invisible resilience. So, okay, let's just unpack that.
Let's do it.
Because before we can really understand how the Maya fought off the Spanish Empire for literal centuries, we kind of have to understand who they actually were.
And who they weren't.
Yes, exactly. Because I'll admit, I've always heard the word Maya tossed around as if it was this singular, monolithic empire, like Rome.
Right. You picture a guy in a capital city issuing decrees to the provinces.
Exactly. But Lewin's research takes us way, way back. It shows how this identity slowly crawled out of the mist of Mesoamerican prehistory.
Okay.
I mean, we're talking around 8,000 BC here.
Yeah, to really grasp the mechanics of their survival later on, we have to start with those deep origins. The earliest evidence of human presence in eastern Mesoamerica points to these Paleo-Indian hunters and gatherers around 8,000 BC.
So long before any pyramids.
long before, and these weren't city builders yet, obviously. Over millennia, they had to painstakingly adapt to a very diverse environment.
Which is a crazy landscape, right?
Yeah.
You got coastal swamps, dense lowland jungles, and then freezing highland mountains all packed together.
It's an incredibly challenging geography. Slowly, they transitioned into these archaic gathering and early agricultural societies. By roughly 2000 to 1300 BC, we see villages heavily reliant on agriculture.
And that's where the big three staples emerge, right? Maize, beans, and squash.
Exactly. The famous Mesoamerican triad.
And from the reading, this period also marks the introduction of ceramics, which, sounds like a really small detail until you think about what it actually means for a society.
That changes everything.
Right. You aren't just eating what you catch today anymore. You are storing food. You are boiling water safely. You are essentially creating the technological baseline for staying in one single place.
Precisely. Ceramics represent a major technological leap for household cooking and, crucially, surplus storage. But the most vital point Lewin makes about this era is that the Maya didn't just suddenly appear in a vacuum.
Like they didn't just drop out of the sky fully formed.
Right. They emerged from an incredibly complex Mesoamerican melting pot.
A cultural corridor, almost. And this is where the Olmecs come into the picture, from roughly 1300 to 600 BC.
Yes, the Olmecs are a huge piece of this puzzle.
Because the sources describe them creating these colossal stone heads weighing up to 60 tons. They're establishing massive ceremonial centers and developing this complex iconography over on the Tabasco Veracruz coast.
Which is truly monumental for the time.
But here's the thing. I always learned in school that the Olmecs were the mother culture of the region. Like they basically invented everything and just handed it down to the Maya and the Aztecs.
Right, that was the standard textbook narrative for a long time.
But our sources are pointing out that this mother culture idea is highly debated now.
It is heavily contested today. Modern scholars like Arthur Demarest, whose work is heavily cited in Lewin's thesis, fundamentally challenge that mother culture model.
So what's the alternative theory?
Well, Demarest suggests a very different mechanism. Instead of a single source radiating culture outward, like a stone dropped in a pond, he describes a continuous, intense, and unbroken interaction across the whole Mesoamerican area.
I'm trying to picture that. So it's less like a parent teaching a child and more like an ancient internet.
That is actually a very helpful way to visualize it. It was this massive lattice of ongoing exchanges.
Just constant data transfer.
Exactly. Information, iconography, agricultural techniques, and scientific knowledge were moving in multiple directions simultaneously among all these emerging elites across the entire region. The people who would later be known as the Maya were just one part of this boiling pot. They were sharing traits with the Olmecs, yes, but also with other neighboring groups.
And so slowly, over centuries of this exchange, they began to separate and develop their own distinct, localized characteristics.
Right. It wasn't an overnight rebranding.
It's this gradual accumulation of traits. Because Lewin notes that by 1000 BC to roughly 8300, you start seeing Mammon-style ceramics, this really high-quality monochrome pottery showing up across different sites.
Which points to a shared aesthetic starting to form.
Yeah. And linguistically, Michael Coe points out that a Proto-Maya language was spoken as far back as 2000 BC. But it's the classic era, from roughly 300 to 900 AD, where the culture we really think of as Maya crystallizes.
Yes, this is the era of the massive pyramids and the hieroglyphs that everyone pictures.
And what's fascinating here is not just the architecture, but the sheer scale and uniformity of certain philosophical concepts across such a vast, difficult terrain.
During the Classic era, the Maya lowlands, which spanned parts of modern-day Guatemala, Mexico, Belize, and Honduras, saw the rise of these remarkable city-states.
Like Tikal, Copan, Palenque.
Exactly. And these weren't just dense population centers. They were complex societies ruled by a figure called the Kuhul Ajah, which translates to a holy lord.
The sources really emphasize this title, the Kuhul Ajah. But help me understand the mechanics of this kind of rulership, because they weren't just a mayor or a general.
Yeah, not at all. The Kuhul Ajah was essentially the personified axis of the universe.
The axis of the universe. That is quite a job title.
It really is. They were shaman king. In the Maya worldview, the cosmos required constant, active maintenance.
It wasn't just ticking away on its own.
Right. The bloodletting rituals and ceremonies performed by the Holy Lord were deemed biologically and spiritually essential for the continuation of the world.
So if they don't do the ritual, the world literally ends.
That was the belief. Without the Kuhul Ajah, the rain simply wouldn't fall, the maize wouldn't grow, and the sun might not even rise.
Which is terrifying. And that brings us to their absolute obsession with time.
Oh, their concept of time is incredible.
The text quotes Miguel León Portilla, who says that to pass over their chronovision would be to deprive this culture of its soul. They had this concept called kin.
Yes, kin.
And that meant sun, day, and time all at once.
Right. It's a very unified concept.
But here's where I struggled a bit with the reading, because time wasn't a straight line for them. Like, we think of time as an arrow moving from the past into the future. But for them, it was circular.
An ever-repeating cycle.
Right. So how does a society function day to day if they genuinely believe time is a circle?
It changes absolutely everything about how you interact with reality. Think about it. If time is an arrow, the past is gone and it's unreachable.
You can't go back.
Exactly. But if time is a circle, events physically repeat. Certain days within their incredibly complex calendrical cycles carried specific energies or burdens.
Like a personality for each day.
Yes. Every single day had a particular holiness and a historical weight. If a battle was won on a certain day in the previous cycle, a king might actually wait to launch a new war until that exact day came around again.
Because he believed the outcome was cosmically guaranteed.
Exactly. It dictated their agriculture, their diplomacy, their warfare, and of course their breathtaking architecture.
Like, architecture is just wild. The sources talk about the use of the false arch or the corbelled vault and these massive roof combs adorned with images of gods.
And the cities themselves were spatial reflections of the universe. The monumental architecture was heavily tied to ancestor worship.
Right, because underneath those massive pyramids were the tombs of previous rulers.
And remember, because time is circular and the spiritual world is layered directly on top of the physical world, those deceased ancestors weren't just gone.
They were still around.
Very much so. They were venerated daily as intercessors with the gods. You lived with your ancestors. They were an active part of your daily political and spiritual life.
Which is such a profound, almost comforting way to look at the world, really. The text notes that the glyph for a human being, Winnick, was used for both living people and supernatural beings.
Yes, they all shared this one cosmic geography.
But here is the massive contradiction that the texts just drop on us. Despite all these shared cultural markers, the hieroglyphs, the ball cords, the stunning jade jewelry, the pantheon of gods, this shared kin concept of time, they never united into one pan-regional state.
No, they didn't. They weren't an empire.
And the biggest shocker of all, at least for me, they didn't even call themselves Maya.
This is a critical distinction that completely shifts how we view their history. The term Maya is entirely an external label.
The origins of it are almost an historical accident, right?
It really is. According to the research of Wolfgang Gabbert, which is cited in the text, Christopher Columbus, during his fourth voyage in 1502, encountered a large merchant canoe off the coast of Honduras.
Okay, picture this. 1502. Columbus in a boat.
Right. And through whatever rudimentary communication they managed to have, the crew of this canoe indicated they came from a land called Maya.
Maya.
Yes. Gabbert suggests this originally referred to a specific province on the coast of the Yucatan, which was likely connected to the prominent post-classic city of Mayapan.
Wait, let me get this straight. So it was just a local place name?
Yes, just a local region.
Columbus hears one guy from one specific trading canoe say, "Hey, I'm from Mayapan," and the Spanish just slapped that label on millions of people across hundreds of miles.
That is essentially exactly what happened. In early colonial Spanish documents, the word Maya primarily refers to the language of the Yucatan region, maybe occasionally to the territory, and only very rarely to the people themselves.
That is wild.
It is. The indigenous people absolutely did not possess a common ethnic consciousness that encompassed all speakers of Yucatec Maya, let alone the dozens of other distinct language groups up in the Highland Mountains.
So how do they identify themselves? Like, if I walked up to a farmer in Tikal in 600 AD, who would he say he was?
He would identify himself hyper-locally. He would tell you his ka, which is his specific village or community.
Okay.
And he would tell you his chibal, which is his patronym group or his direct blood lineage. His allegiance was solely to his immediate land, his local holy lord, and his bloodline.
But if they didn't call themselves Maya, isn't applying that term backward in time just kind of lazy history?
Well, it certainly oversimplifies things.
Because it feels like, I don't know, an alien landing in Brooklyn today, hearing someone say they're from the Northeast, and suddenly the alien decides to call everyone on the eastern seaboard Northeasterners.
That's a great analogy.
Right. It completely ignores the fact that the guy from Brooklyn would fiercely, passionately deny being the same kind of person as someone from Boston. We've just painted over their entire internal, deeply held map with a giant, inaccurate brush.
I'm really glad you brought that up because it hits at the core of a major anthropological debate mentioned in Lewin's thesis.
Okay, lay on me.
It's the tension between primordialism and instrumentalism.
Okay, hold on. Primordialism and instrumentalism. You're going to have to explain those to me like I'm 5 because they sound incredibly dense.
Fair enough. Let's break it down. Think of primordialism as the idea that your ethnicity is deep in your bones. It's essential.
Like it's just a biological fact of who you are.
Exactly. It is tied to the specific patch of earth you were born on, the blood of your ancestors, and the language you first spoke. It is unchanging. That is how the ancient people saw their ka and cheese ball.
Deeply rooted.
Yes. Instrumentalism, on the other hand, sees ethnicity as a tool, an instrument.
Oh, I see.
It's the idea that identity can be consciously constructed, altered, or utilized for political or social ends to achieve a specific goal.
Okay, so saying I am from this specific lineage is primordial. But outsiders grouping them all together as Maya for administrative convenience is an instrumental use of identity.
Exactly. And understanding that their baseline reality was fragmented, deeply localized, and primordial is absolutely essential for the rest of this story.
Because they weren't this unified front.
No, they were a landscape of fluctuating, expanding, and contracting theater states. They were constantly forming unstable alliances, fighting localized wars, trading, and then breaking those alliances.
There was no single capital to capture.
None. And speaking of those localized wars, this directly feeds into how we need to completely reframe the famous collapse of the classic Maya in the 9th century.
Let's talk about the collapse, because the traditional narrative, the one I definitely grew up with, is that they just suddenly failed, dropped their tools, and vanished into thin air.
Right, the alien abduction theory of history.
Exactly. But the sources provide completely different theories, and they show it wasn't a single catastrophic event at all.
The very term collapse is highly contested among modern scholars because it implies a total disappearance, which is just factually incorrect.
They didn't go anywhere.
Right. What actually happened was a radical transformation and decentralization. The Holy Lords lost their power, the big cities were largely abandoned, but the people themselves survived.
And the mechanism for this transformation varied wildly, depending on which region you look at, right?
Wildly. Let's look at Copan in modern Honduras. The research by Elliot Abrams and David Rue points to massive deforestation there.
Now, usually when you hear about environmental collapse in ancient societies, it's blamed on elite overconsumption. You know, the kings cutting down the forest to build giant monuments to themselves.
That's the usual assumption.
But the text says it was the commoners. That doesn't make sense to me. How do the peasants destroy the environment while the elites are in charge?
It comes down to basic, unrelenting domestic math.
Domestic math.
Yes. It wasn't the elites clearing land for agricultural expansion or burning lime for monumental plaster that pushed Copan over the edge. As the population surged to an estimated 20,000 people around 850 AD, the common households just needed firewood.
Oh, wow. Just basic firewood.
They needed it every single day for domestic cooking and heating.
Basic survival. Just boiling the beans.
Exactly. And 20,000 people require a staggering amount of wood every single week. This relentless decentralized demand stripped the foothills and uplands of trees entirely.
And once the trees are gone.
When the trees were gone, the heavy tropical rains washed away the topsoil. This severe soil erosion diminished their agricultural capacity, which led to malnutrition, disease, and eventually forced the gradual abandonment of the city by 1200 AD.
The environment was literally consumed by the mundane needs of survival.
Yes.
But then you look at the Patex-Patun region in Guatemala, and Arthur Damaris' findings paint a totally different picture. It's like a completely different movie.
It really is.
For 1,000 years, the people there lived in this delicate, sustainable ecological balance with the rainforest. And their warfare was highly constrained and ritualistic.
Yes, traditional Maya warfare was not like European warfare. They didn't typically fight to conquer vast tracts of land or burn rival cities to the ground.
So what were they doing?
They fought to capture specific high-ranking rival elites for status and for ritual sacrifice.
Which sounds brutal, but from an ecological standpoint, it's incredibly sustainable.
It is.
You go in, capture the king or a general, and leave the farmers and the fields completely alone.
Exactly. The warfare didn't disrupt the agricultural base, but Damaris found that at the end of the 7th century, this entire system just broke down in the Patex-Patun region.
Why?
Driven by intense status rivalry among an overgrown elite class, there were simply too many nobles competing for limited prestige. The warfare escalated into an all-out destructive conflict.
It spiraled out of control.
For the first time, they had to build massive defensive walls around their cities.
And the sources detail how they built those walls. It's crazy. They were tearing down their own sacred temples to build barricades.
A true sign of desperation.
And because it was too dangerous to farm out in the distance, they pulled their agriculture inward, right up against the city walls, rapidly exhausting the fragile jungle soil.
Right. It was warfare that destroyed the ecology, not the other way around.
And then, as if deforestation and total war weren't enough, we introduced the climate data.
The climate data is terrifying.
Researchers like Richardson Gill and David Hodel analyzed lake bed sediment cores, right? And they found evidence of the most severe droughts in 8,000 years, hitting the region right around the time of the transition.
Yes, the peaks of these megadroughts are centered at 760, 810, 860, and 910 AD.
Just wave after wave, a perfect storm. You have localized deforestation in Copan, escalated, destructive warfare in Patuxentune, and devastating multi-year droughts punishing the whole region.
It was too much for the system to bear.
And if you think back to the Kuhula Jah, the holy lord whose entire job is to bleed himself to make it rain, what happens to his political power when it doesn't rain for 10 years?
The institution of the divine ruler completely loses its legitimacy. The social contract was broken.
They failed at their one job.
Exactly. When their rituals could no longer produce rain or stability, the population stopped supporting them. The grand classic period ended. But, to return to our main theme, the people did not evaporate.
They survived.
They migrated, they adapted, they reorganized, they transitioned into the post-classic period, shifting their centers of power toward the northern Yucatan Peninsula and the coastal trade routes.
They created new power structures that weren't entirely reliant on a single divine king with absolute power. Power and wealth became more decentralized, trade networks expanded, and society became far more pragmatic.
Exactly. This was the landscape: fragmented, decentralized, deeply local, but incredibly enduring, that existed when the sails of Spanish ships first appeared on the horizon.
Which is the perfect pivot to our second source, the historical analysis of the conquest. Because that fragmentation, the very fact that they didn't have one capital city like Rome or like Tenochtitlan for the Aztecs, became their greatest unintended defense mechanism.
It absolutely did.
I look at this like a hydra. If you can't cut off the head of the snake because there is no head, you have to fight every single scale.
That is the defining characteristic of the Spanish-Maya conflict. It brings us to a stark, almost unbelievable contrast in the timeline of the Spanish conquests in the Americas.
Walk us through the timeline, because it's nuts.
Well, Hernán Cortés arrived in Mexico and conquered the mighty Aztec capital, Tenochtitlan, by August 1521.
So, relatively quick.
Very quick. It was a rapid, decapitating victory over a highly centralized empire. Once the emperor fell and the capital was taken, the empire largely folded.
But the Maya timeline is a completely different universe.
The conquest of the Maya was a grinding, bloody, exhausting 2-century slog.
2 centuries?
Yes. The first real organized military incursions into the Yucatan began in 1527 under Francisco de Montejo. But the last independent Maya kingdom, the Itza, hidden deep in the Piton Basin of Guatemala, didn't fall to the Spanish until 1697.
That is just unbelievable.
And even then, fierce, large-scale rebellions like the Caste War simmered all the way into 1901.
1901. Think about that for a second. The Wright brothers are just 2 years away from flying an airplane. Teddy Roosevelt is becoming U.S. president, and the Maya are still actively resisting Spanish colonial control in the jungles of the Yucatan.
It's a staggering testament to their endurance.
It really is. But I want to back up to the very first encounters, because truth is stranger than fiction here. The Encyclopedia source tells this wild story of a shipwreck in 1511.
Oh, the Gonzalo Guerrero story.
Yes, this is years before Cortés even lands in Mexico. The Spanish caravel Santa Maria de la Barca hits a reef off the coast of Jamaica. The survivors climb into a small boat and drift for 13 agonizing days.
An absolute nightmare.
Half of them die of thirst and exposure. The rest wash up on the eastern coast of the Yucatan.
And their reception by the local Maya is entirely hostile. They're captured immediately by a local halak eunuch, a Maya lord.
And things go bad fast.
Very fast. The captain, Valdivia, and several men are sacrificed. But 2 men, Geronimo de Aguilar and Gonzalo Guerrero, manage to escape the wooden cages and flee into the jungle.
Only to be captured again.
Right, they are captured and enslaved by a different rival Maya lord.
And from there, their paths diverge in the most incredible cinematic way. Aguilar holds on to his Spanish identity for dear life. He keeps his prayer book, learns the local language out of necessity, and eventually gets rescued by Cortés in 1519.
And he becomes an absolutely vital translator for Cortés during the Aztec conquest.
Right, but Gonzalo Guerrero, his story is wild. He goes native.
Guerrero's integration is a fascinating, extreme, early example of the cultural fluidity we will see throughout this deep dive. Guerrero marries a Maya noblewoman.
He fully commits.
He absolutely does. He mutilates his ears and lips for piercings, tattoos his face and body according to Maya custom, and proves his worth in battle. He rises through the ranks to become a Necum, a high-ranking Maya war leader.
That blows my mind. So when the Spanish finally come back in force to conquer the region, Guerrero is literally leading Maya warriors against his former countrymen.
Yes, he is.
He is organizing ambushes against the Spanish. He fully assimilated. It shows that the boundary between conquer and conquered was incredibly porous from the very first minute.
It does. But when the organized Spanish military expeditions finally arrive, beginning with Francisco Hernández de Córdoba in 1517 and Juan de Grijalva in 1518, the technological and tactical clash is staggering.
It's like two different eras colliding.
You have to understand the mechanics of what was happening on these battlefields to understand why the conflict dragged on for so long.
Let's talk about that clash. Because on paper, the Spanish arrived with technology that must have seemed like alien magic. They have early firearms, matchlocks, and arquebus.
Mega crossbows.
They have light artillery on their ships. They have war horses, an animal the Maya had never seen in their entire existence, which provided an overwhelming advantage in height, speed, and sheer psychological shock value.
And they brought terrifying war dogs, massive mastiffs trained to kill.
That is the European arsenal. In contrast, the Maya warriors fielded flint-tipped spears, bows and arrows, and a weapon called the atlotl, which is a brilliantly engineered spear thrower.
Yes, the atlotl acts as an extension of the arm, providing immense leverage to hurl a dart with enough force to pierce armor.
And for close combat, they used heavy wooden clubs and the macuitl.
Ah, the macuitl.
Let's talk about the macuitl, because when you see drawings of this thing in the sources, it basically looks like a cricket bat from hell.
That is an incredibly accurate description. It's a flat, heavy wooden club, but along the edges, they embedded razor-sharp obsidian blades.
And obsidian, just to be clear, is volcanic glass. I read somewhere that a fractured obsidian edge is actually sharper than a modern surgical scalpel.
It is. At the molecular level, it can be just a few nanometers thick. When a Maya warrior swung a macuitl, it was capable of inflicting absolutely horrific, devastating wounds.
It's brutal.
There are Spanish accounts, and this is grim, but it illustrates the point perfectly, of a single blow from a macuitl decapitating a Spanish horse.
Decapitating a horse with a piece of wood and glass.
Exactly. But, and this is a crucial, but when we look at the tactical clash, obsidian is glass. It is incredibly brittle.
Oh, so it shatters.
If a Maya warrior swung that macuitl and it struck the solid Toledo steel of a Spanish broadsword or a steel breastplate, those glass blades would shatter instantly. The Spanish steel was far more durable in a prolonged melee.
So we have this terrifying collision of technologies. And the psychological terror of these early battles is so vivid in the text. Look at the Battle of Aceh in 1528 during Monteo's first major inland push.
It was a sensory nightmare for both sides.
Georges Ferry's text describes the sensory overload. The Maya used hundreds of deafening conch shells and screams to rally their warriors. They were painted in stark earth colors, blacks and reds, and appeared to the deeply Catholic Spanish as, quote, most ferocious devils.
And yet, despite taking incredibly heavy casualties from Spanish artillery and cavalry charges, the Maya just kept coming, fighting with a furious, unyielding rage.
And the resistance only grew more desperate and deeply tragic as the Spanish pushed into the Highland Mountains. We see this vividly in the siege of Zaculi in the Guatemalan highlands in 1525.
That siege is one of the darkest chapters.
Gonzalo de Alvarado, brother to the infamous conquistador Pedro de Alvarado, cornered the Maya leader Caibil Balam and thousands of warriors and civilians in their formidable mountaintop fortress.
The Spanish couldn't breach the defenses immediately because of the steep ravines surrounding the fortress, so they just settled in for a siege to starve them out.
Right. They intercepted and annihilated an 8,000-strong Maya relief army trying to break the siege.
And after several months, the starvation inside Zaculir became unbearable, forcing the surrender.
When the Spanish finally entered the fortress, what they found was apocalyptic. There were 1,800 unburied dead, and the survivors were so starved they were resorting to eating the corpses of their own people.
It is horrific. It highlights the absolute totality and brutality of the Spanish campaign. And yet, amidst all this slaughter and technological disparity, there's a fascinating detail in the sources about adaptation.
But this time, it's the Spanish adapting to the Maya.
Yes. When the Spanish arrived, they were wearing their heavy European steel armor.
Right, breastplates, Morian helmets.
But in the sweltering 90-degree heat and 90% humidity of the tropical Yucatan jungle, that steel armor was a literal death trap.
I can't even imagine baking inside that metal.
It was too hot, causing heat stroke. It rusted almost immediately in the dampness. It was cumbersome in the dense underbrush. So what did the Spanish do? They ditched it.
They ditched the steel.
They actively discarded their advanced European technology and adopted the indigenous body protection, these thick, salt-soaked, quilted cotton tunics called escupiles.
They armored themselves and their horses in indigenous cotton. Here's where it gets really interesting to me. It's like modern elite soldiers deploying to a jungle, ditching their high-tech Kevlar body armor, and realizing the local tactical gear is simply superior for the environment.
It was pure survival pragmatism.
It really begs the question, who was actually conquering who here? The environment forced the Spanish to literally wear the skin of the culture they were trying to destroy.
That adaptation speaks to the harsh reality of the geography, which overwhelmingly favored the Maya.
The terrain was their ally.
The dense jungles, the complete lack of surface rivers in the northern Yucatan, meaning the Spanish had to rely on hidden cenotes for water, and the punishing heat all neutralized many of the Spanish advantages. But there is a more fundamental mismatch in the core philosophy of war that prolonged this agony for centuries.
What do you mean?
Well, as we discussed with the Patex-Batoon collapse, traditional Mesoamerican warfare was largely focused on capturing live prisoners.
Right. They wanted you alive for status and sacrifice. The encyclopedia text explicitly says taking prisoners was the priority, whereas for the Spanish, taking prisoners was a hindrance on the battlefield.
The Spanish fought a European style of war aimed at total subjugation, territorial control, and rapid resource extraction, specifically the search for gold and silver.
It was a total culture clash.
Exactly. When the Maya realized the Spanish weren't playing by the traditional Mesoamerican rules, that the Spanish intended to kill everyone and destroy the cities, they adapted their tactics.
It shifted their whole strategy.
They abandoned open-field massed battles where Spanish cavalry and cannons dominated. They turned to ambush. They turned to guerrilla tactics, leveraging their intimate knowledge of the treacherous terrain.
And they got creative. In the highlands, they even started digging deep camouflaged pits lined with sharpened, fire-hardened stakes, specifically designed to kill the Spanish horses.
But the most devastating weapon the Spanish brought wasn't steel or horses or even a philosophy of total war. It was completely invisible, and it was biological. The old world diseases.
The disease factor is it's hard to process.
The demographic collapse caused by disease is difficult for a modern mind to fully comprehend. Smallpox, measles, influenza, typhus, and later malaria and yellow fever swept through the indigenous populations.
And they had absolutely zero immunity.
The peoples of the Americas had absolutely no genetic resistance to these pathogens. The text states that a single infected soldier arriving in Mexico in 1520 introduced smallpox.
One soldier.
That virus raced down the vast indigenous trade routes faster than the Spanish armies could even march.
The numbers in the sources are staggering. In the Yucatan, the mortality rate was approximately 50%. In the Tabasco region, the population dropped by an estimated 90%.
In the Soconusco coastal region, a 90 to 95% wipeout.
It's estimated that overall, 75% to 90% of the entire indigenous population was eliminated by disease within the first century of contact. Entire armies, complex lineages, elders, and repositories of scientific knowledge were erased before a Spanish sword was even swung in their direction.
This invisible conqueror fundamentally altered the physical and political landscape. It emptied out massive regions, and this demographic void made the Spanish policy of reducciones much easier to implement.
Let's explain reducciones, because this is the real pivot point into the next era of survival.
The Spanish authorities needed to control the surviving population. You cannot tax or convite a population that is scattered in tiny hamlets across impenetrable jungle.
This administrative nightmare.
Exactly. So the Spanish instituted the reducciones. They forced the remaining scattered Maya populations to abandon their ancestral lands and move into concentrated European-style grid towns.
Forced relocation.
Yes. The goal was containment. They wanted the indigenous people easily taxable, easily drafted for forced labor, and easily reachable by Catholic missionaries.
Which leads us into the darkest, but perhaps the most brilliantly resilient chapter of this entire story. Because when the Maya could no longer win on the open battlefield and their populations were decimated by disease, the resistance didn't just end.
No, it just changed form.
It went underground. It forced a profound psychological and cultural adaptation.
The institution of the reducciones created a deep, agonizing psychological schism within the Maya world. John F. Chichiak's research on colonial Yucatan illuminates this beautifully.
How so?
The Spanish colonial order effectively divided the Maya into two distinct categories. On one side, you had the householders.
The householder.
These were the Maya who assimilated. They lived in the nucleated grid towns, they paid their tribute to the Spanish crown, they attended Catholic Mass, and they effectively became a cog in the Spanish colonial machine.
They survived by playing the game.
Yeah.
You nod at the friar, you pay your taxes, you keep your head down.
Exactly. But on the other side, you had the forest dwellers. By the turn of the 17th century, a significant portion of the Maya, sometimes a quarter of a local population, refused to play the game.
They just left.
They fled the reduciones. They slipped back into the dense jungle to reestablish traditional communities, hidden away from Spanish control, taxes, and priests.
And this is where the tragedy of colonization really twists the knife. The Spanish authorities obviously hated the forest dwellers. They demonized them, labeling them savages, barbarians, and idolaters in their official reports. But who did the Spanish use to hunt them down? The householders.
This is a devastating example of how colonial power fractures indigenous identity. Chuchiak points out that the householders, in order to prove their loyalty and secure their own safety within the brutal colonial hierarchy, actively joined Spanish soldiers in hunting down the forest dwellers.
Imagine the psychology of that.
It's incredibly dark.
The householders began to internalize the Spanish viewpoint. They started seeing themselves as the true, civilized Christian Maya while viewing the forest dwellers, people who spoke their exact same language, who shared their blood and their recent ancestors, as inferior others.
Exactly.
Imagine you are a householder. You go to Mass, you pay your taxes, but at night, you know your own cousin is out in the jungle living the old way. And tomorrow, the Spanish might put a spear in your hand and ask you to guide a hunting party to find him.
It's the ultimate divide and conquer.
It really is. They reconstructed their identity in a way that allowed them to persecute their own brethren without feeling like they were betraying their ethnicity.
It is a profound tragedy. But even for those householders who stayed in the towns, the assimilation was often just a surface-level illusion. And this is where we get into the core concept of cultural domestication that Ulf Lewin writes about.
Right, the smuggling of their culture.
The Maya didn't just let their culture be erased. They absorbed Spanish culture without losing their own core worldview. They essentially smuggled their cosmos past the Spanish Inquisition.
How do you do that? How do you smuggle a religion?
Marshall Sahlins' anthropological theory is highly relevant here. He warns against underestimating the native ability to turn foreign goods, concepts, and even gods to the service of their own domestic ideas.
So they repurposed the Spanish religion.
Exactly. Accepting the Spanish alphabet or even Christian iconography didn't automatically erase their Mayaness. The Maya are masters of inclusion. They simply brought the foreign into their own logical framework.
The best example of this in the text, the one that really blew my mind, is the Christian cross.
Oh, that's a perfect example.
When the Spanish missionaries arrived, holding up the crucifix, expecting violent resistance to this new god, the Maya often accepted the symbol with surprising ease. They bowed to it.
The Spanish thought it was a miracle.
Right. But why? Because the Catholic cross perfectly mirrored the ancient Maya world tree, the Huacachán.
Exactly. The Huacachán stood at the center of the Maya cosmos. It represented the four cardinal directions and the vertical connection between the underworld, the earth, and the heavens.
So it already looked like a cross.
It was a cross. It was also deeply associated with the origin of maize, and therefore human life. When the Maya bowed to the cross, the missionaries thought they were saving souls. The Maya were just venerating their ancient center of the universe in a slightly new wooden shape.
I love this. I like to think of it as a Trojan horse in reverse.
That's a great way to put it.
Instead of sneaking your soldiers into the enemy city to destroy it, the Maya sneaked their ancient gods and their worldview right into the enemy's religion to protect them. They hacked the colonial system to save their souls. But how did that actually look in practice? If I'm a Maya person in a colonial church, what am I actually doing?
We see exactly how it looks in Robert Carlson's modern studies of Santiago Atitlan in the Guatemalan highlands. The 16th century Catholic church there features a massive, intricate wooden altarpiece.
Okay.
On the surface, if a Spanish bishop walked in, it looks entirely Christian. Saints, angels, Jesus. But if you know how to look, the entire structure is crowned by the Maya world tree.
Hidden in plain sight.
Even today, during the procession of the town's patron saint, Santiago, the Catholic ritual serves as a vessel for an ancient Maya cosmological journey.
Explain the mechanism of that journey.
Well, during the festival, the saint's effigy is carried from the exact center of the church floor, which for the local Maya marks the literal center of the universe, the belly button of the world.
The belly button of the world. I love that.
They carry the saint out to the four corners of the town, mapping the ancient four-directional cosmos of their ancestors before returning it to the center.
So to the Catholic Church, it's just a Saints' Day parade. But to the Maya, it is the vital, ancient ritual of maintaining the boundaries of the universe.
It's brilliant. The flexibility is their armor. And they did the exact same thing with language and literature. Look at the Popol Vuh, the great Quiche Maya holy book.
The Popol Vuh.
It details the creation of the cosmos, the hero twins, the lords of the underworld.
And this was a massive piece of cultural survival. It was originally passed down orally and likely through folding bark paper or hieroglyphic books, right?
Yes, but the Spanish burned almost all those books. So in the early 18th century, a Dominican friar named Francisco Jimenez copied and translated a version of the Popol Vuh that had been secretly written down by the Quiche Maya themselves around 1701.
But here's the genius part. They didn't write it in their ancient hieroglyphs because that would have gotten them killed by the Inquisition.
Right, they wrote it using the Roman alphabet, the very letters the missionaries taught them to read the Bible.
Precisely. As the scholar Dennis Tedlock notes in his analysis, the Quiche Maya learned to use the Roman alphabet as a mask for their ancient texts, just as they used the Catholic saints as masks for their gods.
It's incredible.
They took the intellectual tool meant to indoctrinate them and turned it into the very vessel that immortalized their own creation story.
They domesticated the alphabet. It's an incredible testament to resilience, which transitions us naturally, though tragically, to the final major era we need to unpack.
Let's get into it.
Because this centuries-long strategy of hyperlocal, quiet, localized resistance bending without breaking, hiding in plain sight, has suddenly shifted in our modern era. To survive the 21st century, the descendants of the Maya are trying to do something their ancient ancestors never actually achieved.
They're trying to unite.
Yes. We are stepping onto the modern battlefield now. And just to ground us here, listener, the texts we are looking at for the section, particularly Lewin's thesis and Bastos and Camus's sociological work, are analyzing a highly volatile, deeply tragic period, the late 20th century Guatemalan Civil War.
And we want to be very clear here.
We are looking strictly through the lens of their sociological data to understand how these historical events forged modern identity. We are looking objectively at the mechanisms of survival, rather than taking a political stance on the conflict itself.
Absolutely. So following the data in the text, the context for this modern shift is incredibly dark. For centuries after the colonial period ended, the indigenous Maya in Guatemala were systemically marginalized by the Ladino or non-indigenous elite state structures.
They were largely excluded from political power, treated often as second-class citizens, and relegated to severe poverty.
And then from 1960 to 1996, Guatemala was torn apart by a devastating internal civil war.
The academic sources outline that during this conflict, state military campaigns heavily targeted rural indigenous communities, often associating them with leftist insurgencies. Anthropologist Barbara Tedlock's research notes that during the most violent periods, particularly in the early 1980s, tens of thousands of Guatemalans, predominantly Maya, were killed.
Hundreds of thousands became internal refugees or fled the country entirely. The physical and cultural destruction was profound.
The sources mention that even clothing became a matter of life and death. The traditional woven blouse, the huipil, which historically identifies a woman's specific local village, became dangerous to wear.
Wait, their clothing made them targets?
It marked them as targets if their specific village was suspected by the military of sympathizing with insurgents, so women had to abandon their ancestral clothing just to survive.
That is heartbreaking. The Civil War officially ended with the peace accords in 1996. And a crucial foundational part of those accords was the 1995 Agreement on Identity and Rights of Indigenous Peoples, known as AIDPI.
The text of that agreement is a watershed moment in Mesoamerican history because the state officially, legally recognized the Maya identity as a fundamental component of the Guatemalan nation.
It legally recognized their descent, their languages, their worldview, and their culture.
It was a monumental legal recognition on paper. But on the ground, the texts note that everyday life for many Maya remained mired in systemic poverty and political marginalization.
Right. But the ashes of that horrific conflict gave rise to a brand new phenomenon, the Pan-Maya movement. This is a conscious, active political and cultural awakening, but it's driven primarily by an educated urban Maya elite.
Yes, these are scholars, linguists, lawyers, and activists operating in the capital. And what they are doing is a fascinating exercise in social engineering. They are looking at a population of millions of people divided into 22 officially recognized, distinct ethnic groups in Guatemala alone.
Groups like the Quiche, the Quechical, the Tzotzil, the Quechi, and so on.
Groups that, as we established earlier, have never historically viewed themselves as one single people. And these urban activists are saying, we need to unite under the banner of Maya to demand our political rights and ensure our cultural survival.
But doing that creates intense internal friction, which Lewin's thesis explores in really compelling depth, because you have a profound disconnect between the urban activists writing manifestos in the city and the rural traditionalists working the fields.
Let's look at a specific mechanism of that friction. If you go to a rural farmer in the Alta Verapaz department, as anthropologist Richard Wilson did in his study of the Quechi people, that farmer doesn't wake up in the morning and think, I am a proud, unified Maya.
He identifies simply as a Quechi of his specific village.
Furthermore, his spirituality is deeply primordially tied to his local Tzultaka.
The Tzultaka being the living mountain spirit, right?
Exactly. The Tzultaka isn't a generic god. It is the specific physical mountain that owns the local land, controls the local rain, and watches over the local maize crop.
So his entire worldview is that mountain.
The farmer's allegiance is to that mountain, not to a broad, abstract Pan-Maya political identity being promoted by politicians in the capital.
But Lewin gives this great example of how activists and scholars are trying to bridge that exact gap. He talks about archaeologists working at the ancient Cancun ruin site. They didn't just show up, dig up the temples, and tell the local Quechi villagers, hey, look, these are your ancestors' ruins. You are Maya.
No, they didn't. Instead, the archaeologists actively participated in local rituals with the villagers to ask the local Tzultaka mountain spirit for permission to excavate the earth.
That is so smart.
That is a crucial step. By engaging the Tzultaka, they bridged the ancient, monumental classic site with the living, highly localized spiritual reality of the villagers.
They connected the dots for them.
Through that shared ritual, they helped the villagers see themselves not just as isolated Quechi farmers, but as the direct descendants of the grand classic civilization that built Cancun. It's a delicate, active construction of identity.
Wait, construction of identity.
Right.
This brings us back to that term you used earlier, instrumentalism.
Yes, exactly. The Pan-Maya activists are engaging in instrumentalism or constructivism. They are purposefully constructing a unified ethnic identity as a modern political tool.
They're building a new identity out of old parts.
They are promoting the use of the 22 Mayan languages as a core unifying marker. They are elevating the huipil from just a dangerous local village marker to a broad, safe symbol of pan-indigenous pride and resistance.
We even see urban Maya professionals adopting Pan-Maya clothing styles, deliberately combining woven elements from entirely different regions into a single outfit to project unity.
And my absolute favorite detail from Circe Sturm's research in the text. Modern Highland Maya activists in Guatemala are taking classes to learn the ancient classic period hieroglyphs.
Which is wild, right?
Because those hieroglyphs originally belonged to lowland kingdoms hundreds of miles away, completely different from their highland ancestors. But they are learning them and using them in their modern activism to build a shared pre-Columbian historical depth.
It is a deliberate instrumental blurring of historical and geographical details to serve a very urgent modern need. As the anthropologist Edward Fisher notes in our sources, the movement's leaders are consciously constructing new bases for Maya identity.
But, and this is the genius of it, they are grounding that constructed identity in the essential primordial truths of their past. They use the ancient language, their ancestral connection to the earth, the circular calendar, to build a modern political fortress.
So what does this all mean? The activists are essentially asking rural villagers to adopt a brand new Maya identity, a word that, let's remember, was invented by outsiders, spoken by Columbus, and originally applied by the Spanish in order to protect their ancient hyperlocal identity.
It's a paradox, but a necessary one.
It's like forming a massive labor union. You have to give up a little bit of your fierce individual independence to get enough collective bargaining power to survive the crushing pressure of the modern state.
That is a very apt way to frame the mechanism of what they are doing. To face the homogenizing pressures of the 21st century nation-state and the forces of globalized modernity, the fragmented reality that originally saved them from the Spanish, that inability to be conquered all at once because they had no head, is no longer sufficient.
The old strategy doesn't work anymore.
To survive today, they require unity. It is a brilliant, highly adaptable political survival mechanism. They are taking the very label the outside world used to define them, and they are turning it into a shield.
Which brings us full circle. We started this hour looking through the kaleidoscope for a vanished civilization. We expected the romantic myth of cities swallowed by the jungle and a people who just disappeared, and instead we found a people who are absolute masters of adaptation.
We journeyed from a fragmented collection of brilliant, warring city-states that accidentally formed an unconquerable, multi-headed hydra against the Spanish Empire,
Right.
through the dark centuries of the colonial reducciones where they hid their entire cosmos inside Catholic altars and the Roman alphabet,
Bending the conqueror's tools.
all the way to today's political renaissance, where the very concept of being Maya is being forged into a modern weapon of survival.
It really forces us to reconsider what words like collapse and survival actually mean.
True resilience, as we see clearly in the Maya continuum across thousands of years, isn't about remaining rigid. It isn't about standing unchanging like a stone monument against the forces of history.
Because eventually, stone crumbles.
Exactly. True resilience is about fluidity. It is the capacity to adapt, to absorb the foreign, to domesticate the tools of your conquerors, and to continually rewrite your own narrative, all while keeping the core heartbeat of your culture completely intact.
It's the water wearing down the rock. And it leaves me with this final thought for you to mull over as you go about your day. We've just spent all this time marveling at how the Maya could take the language, the religion, and even the administrative labels of their conquerors and subtly bend them into vessels to keep their own ancient world alive.
A profound skill.
Take a look at your own daily habits. Look at your family traditions, the holidays you celebrate, your deepest beliefs, the stories you tell about who you are and where you come from. What parts of your own identity are actually ancient survival mechanisms, quietly wearing the mask of modern life?